71. Self-actualization, PT6. Well, Daphne whispered, keeping her voice as low as she could, at least now I don't feel like the only sane person in Hogwarts anymore. Because now you've got the rest of us as friends, whispered Lavender Brown, who was tiptoeing along at her left side. I don't think that's what she means, General Granger murmured from Lavender's own left. They crept slowly and carefully through the corridors of Hogwarts, all 8 of them keeping both ears peeled for the slightest sound of trouble, just like it was a battle, and they were looking for enemy soldiers to ambush. Only in this case, they were looking for bullies to vanquish and victims to rescue in the span between the end of breakfast time and when Lavender and Parvati had to get to their herbology class. Lavender had argued that if one first-year girl could take down 3 older bullies, then 8 first-year girls ought to be able to outfight 24 older bullies because of multiplication. Judging by her frantic spluttering and waving of hands, General Granger hadn't found this convincing. Padma had stayed silent for a bit during the ensuing argument, and then observed thoughtfully that even in Hogwarts, beating up first-year girls probably wouldn't be good for your reputation as a bully. Parvati had straightened up at this, exclaiming that this meant they were the only ones who could do something about Hogwarts's bully problem, which made it really, truly heroic. Plus, the whole reason their parents had moved to Britain was so that the 2 of them could attend the world's only magical school with a 0% fatality rate. And what was the point if they didn't take advantage and try a few things? To which General Granger had responded that Parvati didn't understand the point of a perfect safety record at all. Lavender had said that if they were really all friends together, and not Hermione's followers like Professor Quirrell thought, then they should vote on things like this. Daphne had expected that hers would be the deciding vote after Hermione and Susan and Hannah voted no. And so Daphne had considered it carefully after her first flush of enthusiasm wore off. She was a Slytherin after all, and that meant it was her responsibility to keep a watchful eye on their own interests while they were all running around trying to help people her job to figure out how risky it really was, and whether it would be worth it for them, just like Mother would have done in her place. Always looking out for yourself and your friends like that was what real Slytherining was all about. Hannah Abbott, the nervous little Hufflepuff girl, had in a small, trembling voice said yes. And now Daphne and Susan and Hermione had to stay with the other 5. They couldn't possibly let the others go off on their own, because no Gryffindor would ever live down hurting the last surviving child of the Bones family, and no Slytherin would dare assault a daughter of the noble and most ancient house of Greengrass. Daphne hoped so anyway. And General Granger, who'd started the whole thing, you didn't even have to ask. The corridors of Hogwarts passed them by one after another, their tense hands never straying far from their wands, as stone and wood and ever-burning torches came into vision and then moved past. At one point, they heard footsteps and drew in their breath, hands almost dropping to their wands, but it was just a lone older Ravenclaw who looked at them curiously before sniffing and dropping his head back to his book as he walked on. The heroines crept past solemn oaken panels carved with gilded frescoes and came to a dead end leading into a boys' bathroom and turned around and wandered back through the solemn oaken panels carved with gilded frescoes and then turned through dusty old brick corridors grouted with worn cement, which sort of led them in a circle actually. So they consulted a portrait and then went down a different dusty old brick corridor instead. That took them to a brief rise of marble stairs that should have put them on the 3rd and a half floor if it had been anywhere but Hogwarts, and then it was back to tiled stone pavement again, and skylights that let shafts of sunlight pour down even though they were nowhere near the roof. And after they'd followed that passageway around a few corners, it took them to another boys' bathroom, clearly marked with a plaque showing the silhouette of a robed figure whizzing into a toilet. The 8 of them stood before the closed door and stared with a certain amount of weariness. "I'm bored," said Lavender. Padma made a show of taking a pocket watch out of her robes and looking at it. 16 minutes and 30 seconds, she said. A new record for the longest attention span in Gryffindor. "I don't think this is going to work either," said Susan. "And I'm a Hufflepuff." "You know," Lavender said thoughtfully, "I wonder if maybe what really makes someone a hero is that when they try something like this, something interesting actually happens." "I bet you're right," said Tracy. I bet if we had Harry Potter with us, we'd run into 3 bullies and a hidden room full of treasure in the first 5 minutes. I bet that all General Chaos has to do is go to the bathroom, and he, finds Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets or something. Daphne couldn't quite let that one go past. You think Lord Slytherin would have put the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets in a bathroom? What I'm saying, said Susan, as Tracy was opening her mouth to reply, is that we've got no way of actually finding any bullies. I mean, all they've got to do is find a Hufflepuff somewhere, but we've got to run across them at exactly the right time, DUC. Which is a very good problem, because if we did find them, we'd all get squished like bugs. Can't we just do the forbidden third-floor corridor like we're supposed to? Lavender snorted scornfully. You don't become a real heroine just by doing the forbidden things the headmaster tells you not to do. Daphne's mind tried to wrap around this statement as she silently thanked the Sorting Hat for not putting her anywhere near Gryffindor. Come to think, Parvati said slowly. I mean, what are the odds that Harry Potter would run across those 5 bullies on his first morning of school? He must have had some way of finding them. Daphne happened to be standing where looking at Parvati let her see Hermione, so she noticed the Ravenclaw girl's expression change. And then she realized that the Sunshine General had also found some bullies just recently. Oh, said Padma in a tone of sudden realization. Of course, he got told by the ghost of Salazar Slytherin. What? Said Daphne at the same time as several other people. That's who the ghost was that scared me, I'm pretty sure, Padma explained. I mean, I only figured it out afterward, but... Yeah, Salazar Slytherin's ghost doesn't like it when Slytherins bully people. He thinks it shames his name. And the ghost is still keyed into the Hogwarts wards, so he knows everything that happens, I bet. Daphne's mouth was hanging open, and she saw that Hannah had put a hand to her forehead and was leaning against the stone walls, while Tracy's eyes were blazing like little brown stars. Salazar Slytherin's ghost had leagued himself with Harry Potter and had sent Hermione Granger to stop Derek's crew. She would have paid 100 galleons to be there when Draco Malfoy got told about this. Although considering how fast rumors spread through Hogwarts, now that Padma had spilled the beans, Millicent had probably told him 30 minutes ago. In fact, now that Daphne thought about it. So, said Parvati, we've got to ask the boy who lived where to find Salazar Slytherin's ghost. Wow, I guess if I'm saying stuff like that out loud, I might actually be turning into a heroine. Yes, said Lavender. We've got to ask the boy who lived where to find Salazar Slytherin's ghost. We've got to ask the boy who lived where to find Salazar Slytherin's ghost, repeated Hannah in a nervous voice, like she was forcing herself to say it. And if that doesn't work, shouted Tracy, we'll stun Harry Potter, tie him up and bring him with us. It said something, Hermione Granger thought, and it was something rather sad, as the 8 of them strolled back through the maze of twisty little passages that was Hogwarts, their time before the next class having run out without finding any bullies, that she genuinely didn't know whether Harry Potter had been led around by the ghost of Salazar Slytherin or a phoenix or what. And whatever Harry had done, she hoped it didn't work for them. And most of all, she hoped that the others didn't vote for Tracy's idea of stunning Harry Potter and carting his unconscious body around with them to attract adventures. That couldn't possibly work in real life, or if it did, she was giving up. Hermione looked from witch to witch, Tracy chatting with Lavender, and the others making occasional remarks, and her gaze caught on a girl who was subdued and quiet, the one person whose thoughts right now she couldn't guess at all. Hannah, said to the girl walking alongside her. Hermione tried to make her voice as gentle as she could. You don't have to answer, but is it okay if I ask why you voted yes on fighting bullies? Hermione had thought she made her voice soft, but everyone stopped walking, and Lavender and Tracy halted their conversation and looked at them. Hannah's cheeks were already reddening, and just as Hannah opened her mouth, it's 'cause she's got more courage than you think, obviously, said Lavender. Hannah paused with her mouth open. She closed her mouth. She swallowed, hard and visibly, while her cheeks reddened even further. Then Hannah took a deep breath and said, in a small voice, There's a boy I like. The Hufflepuff girl flinched as she said it, and her head darted around nervously to look at everyone looking at her, while the pause and silence stretched. Okay, Susan said eventually. I've got 5 boys I like, said Lavender. Padma and I knew we'd both like the same boys, said Parvati, So we made a list and flipped a nut to see who got to pick first. I know who I'm destined to marry, said Tracy. I don't care what the world says, he's meant to be mine. This made all the other girls look expectantly at Hermione, whose brain had gone ahead and flushed Tracy's last statement entirely so it could focus just on the first thing Hannah had said. Said Hermione. She carefully continued, keeping her voice gentle. Hannah, the reason why you joined the Society for Promotion of Heroic Equality for Witches was that there's a boy who might like you more if you become a hero. The Hufflepuff girl nodded again, her cheeks reddening even further while she stared down at her own reflection in her black polished shoes. She likes Neville Longbottom, actually, Daphne said. The Slytherin gave a woeful sigh. And unfortunately for her, he's going to marry someone else. It's very tragic. This produced a high-pitched eeping sound from Hannah as she went on staring at her feet. Wait, what? Said Lavender. Neville's going to marry someone else. How do you know about this? Who? Daphne just shook her head sadly with a downcast expression. Excuse me, said Hermione, and then when the others looked at her again, while she tried to organize her thoughts. I mean, Hannah, trying to become a hero so that a boy will like you isn't very feminist. It's pronounced feminine, actually, said Padma. And why are you calling Hannah unfeminine? Said Susan. There's nothing unfeminine about wanting to impress a boy. Besides, said Parvati, sounding puzzled, isn't the whole point that we're trying to be heroes even though that isn't feminine? The ensuing discussion would not be remembered by Hermione Granger as one of her most successful forays into the realms of political education. She tried to explain, and then after the resulting argument tried to explain again, while the other 7 girls looked at her more and more skeptically. Afterward, Daphne declared in the imperious tones of the future Lady Greengrass that if this feminism business meant girls weren't allowed to pursue boys in whichever way they pleased, then feminism could stay in the Muggle lands where it belonged. Lavender suggested that maybe witchism could say that witches got to do anything they wanted, which sounded like more fun than feminism. And finally, Padma closed off further discussion by observing wearily that she didn't see much point to going on arguing, since SPHEW wasn't about anything to do with feminism in the first place. It was just about more girls becoming heroes. Hermione had given up at that point. As their charms session that day ended, and the first-year Ravenclaws began shuffling out of the class, Hermione was already wincing to herself. They'd made it to class just barely before the opening gong. They'd had to run right over to their desks and sit down, so there hadn't been time for the awful thing to happen yet. But that just meant that Hermione got to look forward to the coming disaster for the whole class. Sure enough, after Professor Flitwick squeaked his dismissal and everyone rose from their chairs, Harry began walking toward her, and for her own part, Hermione shoved her book into her moleskin pouch and very quickly walked over to the door and threw it open and headed into the corridors. And of course, Harry followed her with a surprised look because they had a library session scheduled. Hermione, Harry said as he closed the door behind him. What's wrong? The door flew open behind Harry not a moment after he closed it, almost hitting Harry as he stepped out of the way, and Padma Patil stepped out of the classroom with a dreadful look of determination upon her face. Excuse me, Mr. Potter, came the awful words, the young girl's high voice resounding through the corridor like the gloomy bells of doom. Can I ask you for help with something? Harry's eyebrows drew up, and he said, You can ask, of course. Can you tell us how to talk to Salazar Slytherin's ghost? We want him to tell us where to find bullies like he tells you. There was a little bit of silence in the corridor outside the classroom. The door opened again, and Sue peered out with an inquiring look. Well, we've got to get to the library, Harry said quite casually, his face looking relaxed. Would you mind following us? And began to walk off in the direction that led to the library on odd-numbered days of the month, and Sue made like she was going to follow, but Harry's face turned toward her for a moment. It wasn't until Harry had rounded a corner that he drew his wand, said in a low, precise voice, Quietus, and then turned to Padma and said, An interesting guess, Miss Patil. Padma looked rather smug then, and said, I should have figured it out earlier, really. There was that hiss in the ghost's voice. I should have thought Parselmouth right away, even before he started talking about Godric Gryffindor. Harry's face didn't change. May I ask, Miss Patil, whether you've shared this thought with— She said it in front of everyone in SPHEW, Hermione said. Harry's eyes had that look they had when he was very rapidly calculating something, and then he said, "Hermione, what's the chance that?" She said it in front of Lavender and Tracy. Said Padma. "Should I not have done that?" "Wait here," growled Mr. Goyle, and went around the corner, and there was the sound of him knocking on Draco Malfoy's private room. There was a bit of a queasy feeling in Tracy's stomach, and she reminded herself again that since Padma had spilled the beans, someone was bound to tell Draco Malfoy, and it might as well be her, and it wasn't as if she owed Harry Potter anything, and a Slytherin had to do what was necessary to achieve her ambitions. She'd been collecting ambitions ever since Professor Quirrell told her off, and so far she decided that she wanted to own her own Nimbus 2000 broomstick, become super famous, marry Harry Potter, eat chocolate frogs for breakfast every day, and defeat at least 3 Dark Lords just to show Professor Quirrell who was ordinary. "Mr. Malfoy will see you," said the low, menacing voice of Mr. Goyle as he returned, "and you better hope he doesn't think you're wasting his time." The boy loomed at her briefly and then stepped aside. Tracy added having her own servants to her list of ambitions and entered. The Malfoy private bedroom looked just like Daphne's. She'd been privately hoping for diamond chandeliers or golden frescoes on the walls. She'd never have said it in front of Daphne, but the house of Malfoy was a step up from Greengrass. But it was just a small bedroom like Daphne's, and the only difference was that Malfoy's stuff was decorated in silver snakes instead of emerald plants. As she stepped through the doorway, Draco Malfoy, who was perfectly groomed even inside his own bedroom, rose up from his desk chair to greet her with a small, friendly bow, wearing a charming smile just like she was someone who mattered, which made Tracy so flustered that she forgot everything she'd rehearsed inside her head and just blurted out, "I've got something to tell you." "Yes, Gregory said so," Draco Malfoy said smoothly. "Please, Miss Davis, sit down." He gestured to his own desk chair, even as he sat down on his bed. She felt somewhat light-headed as she carefully sat herself down in Malfoy's own chair, her fingers unthinkingly fiddling with how her dress robes fell across her knees, trying to make them look as elegant and uncreased as Draco Malfoy's. "So, Miss Davis," said Draco Malfoy, "what did you want to tell me?" Tracy hesitated, and then when Malfoy's face started to look a bit impatient, just stammered it all out. Everything Padma had said about Salazar Slytherin's ghost sending Harry Potter to stop bullies, and also what Daphne had told her about Hermione Granger being in on it. Draco Malfoy's expression didn't change at all as she spoke, not even in the slightest, and it dawned on Tracy with a sickening lurch in her stomach. "You don't believe me," she said. There was a slight pause. "Well," said Draco Malfoy, with a smile that wasn't quite as charming as his last one, "I do believe that's what Padma said, and what Daphne said, so thank you anyway, Miss Davis." The boy rose from where he'd been sitting on his bed, and Tracy, not even thinking, rose from the chair. As he was escorting her to the door, just as he was about to turn the knob, it occurred to Tracy that, "You didn't ask what I wanted for the information," she said. Draco Malfoy gave her some kind of look. She didn't quite know what it was supposed to mean, and he didn't say anything. "Well, anyway," Tracy said, making an on-the-spot change to her previous plans, "I don't want anything for the information. I was just being friendly." A brief look of surprise crossed Draco Malfoy's face for just an instant before his expression flattened again, and he said, "It's not that easy to become friends with a Malfoy, Miss Davis." Tracy smiled and meant it. "Well, I'll just go on being friendly then," she said, and left the room with a skip in her step, feeling like a real Slytherin for maybe the first time in her life, and having just decided that Draco Malfoy would be one of her husbands too. After the girl was gone, Gregory came in, shut the door again, and said, "Are you all right, Mr. Malfoy?" Draco said nothing to his servant and friend. His eyes gazed off into nowhere, like he was trying to stare through the wall of his bedroom, through the Hogwarts lake that surrounded the Slytherin dungeons, through Earth's crust and atmosphere and the interstellar dust of the Milky Way, into the utterly empty and lightless void between galaxies which no wizard and no scientist had ever seen. "Mr. Malfoy," Gregory said, starting to sound a little worried. "I can't believe I believed every word of that," said Draco. Daphne finished her final inch of transfiguration and looked up across the Slytherin common room at where Millicent Bulstrode was still working on her own homework. It was time to come to a decision. If SPHEW did go around trying to stun bullies, the bullies wouldn't like it, that was certain. And they'd try to do something unpleasant about it, which was also certain. On the other hand, if the bullies got really nasty, then Hermione could ask Harry Potter for help, or they could pool their combined Quirrell points and ask the defense professor for a favor. No, the thing that Daphne was really worried about was if this business got them in bad with Professor Snape. You didn't want to ever end up on the wrong side of Professor Snape. But since the day she'd challenged Neville to a most ancient duel, she'd noticed people looking at her differently. Even the Slytherins who'd made fun of her were looking at her differently. It was dawning on Daphne that being the daughter of the noble and most ancient house of Greengrass brought in a lot more respect if you were a beautiful heroine born to a most ancient house, and not just a pretty noble girl. It was the difference between having your role played by the lead actress and having your role played by a two-galleon extra with a screechy laugh. Fighting bullies might not be the best way to become a heroine. But father had once told her that the trouble with passing up opportunities was that it was habit-forming. If you told yourself you were waiting for a better opportunity next time, why, next time you'd probably tell yourself the same thing. Father had said that most people spent their whole lives waiting for an opportunity that was good enough, and then they died. Father had said that while seizing opportunities would mean that all sorts of things went wrong, it wasn't nearly as bad as being a hopeless lump. Father had said that, after she got into the habit of seizing opportunities, then it was time to start being picky about them. On the other hand, Mother had warned her not to take all of Father's advice, and said that Daphne wasn't allowed to ask about Father's 6th year in Hogwarts until she was at least 30 years old. But in the end, Father had gotten Mother to marry him and successfully plotted his way into a most ancient house, so there was that. Millicent Bulstrode finished her homework and began putting her things away. Daphne stood up from her desk and walked over. Millicent swung out her legs from the table and stood up, slinging her book bag over one shoulder, then looked over at where Daphne was approaching, the girl's expression puzzled. "Hey, Millicent," Daphne said as she drew near, making her voice low and excited. "Guess what I figured out today? The thing about Salazar Slytherin's ghost helping Granger," said Millicent. "I already heard about that." "No," Daphne said in a hushed whisper. "This is even better." "Really?" Millicent said in an equally low, excited voice. "What is it?" Daphne looked around conspiratorially. "Come to my room and I'll tell you." They went off toward the stairs that led downward. The private rooms were even lower in the lake than the 7th-year dorms. Soon enough, Daphne was sitting in her comfy desk chair, and Millicent had bounced over to the edge of her bed. "Quietus," said Daphne, when they were both seated, and then instead of putting her wand away inside her robes, Daphne just let her hand fall naturally down to her side, still holding the wand just in case. "All right," said Millicent. "What is it?" "You know what I figured out," said Daphne. "I figured out that you get the gossip so fast, you know about things before they actually happen." Daphne had half expected Millicent to turn white and fall over, and she didn't really, but the girl did flinch pretty hard before she started stammering denials. "Don't worry," said Daphne with her sweetest smile. "I won't tell anyone else you're a seer. I mean, we're friends, right?" Ryan Felthorne, 7th year of Slytherin, was working diligently on yet another 2-foot essay. She was taking everything except divination and Muggle studies, and her NEWT year seemed to consist entirely of homework. When her head of house strode up to the table she was working at and barked, "You will come with me, Miss Felthorne," and walked away even as she frantically began putting away her parchment and book and quill. When she caught up with Professor Snape, he was waiting just outside the room and gazing at her with half-lidded eyes that seemed far too intense. And before she could ask what this was about, he spun without a word and stalked off through the hallways, so that she had to scramble to keep up. Their walk took them down a flight of stairs, and then another, below what she'd thought was the lowest level of the Slytherin dungeons. And the corridors began to look older in their appearance, the architecture reverting back in time by centuries into roughened stone held together by crude-looking mortar. She began to wonder if Professor Snape was taking her to the real dungeons that she'd heard rumors of, the true dungeons of Hogwarts that had been sealed off to all but faculty, and if maybe Professor Snape did terrible things down there to innocent, helpless young girls, but that was probably just wishful thinking on her part. They went down another flight of stairs and came out into a room that was no room at all, but an empty rock cavern with a single door, pierced by many dark openings and lit by a single torch of ancient style that fired as they entered. Professor Snape took out his wand then and began to cast charm after charm. She lost track of how many. And when the potion's master was done, he turned back toward her, locked his intense eyes on hers, and said in a level voice unlike his usual drawl, "You will say nothing to anyone of this matter, Miss Felthorne, nothing now or ever. If that is acceptable to you, nod. If not, we will turn and go." She nodded, frightened, and with a strange hope dawning in her heart. Well, not exactly her heart. "The task I have for you is very simple, Miss Felthorne," said Professor Snape's toneless voice, "and your extremely generous pay of 50 galleons is merely to compensate you for being memory charmed afterward." She drew an involuntary breath. Her family might be rich, but they had other daughters and kept her on a tight leash, and it was certainly a lot of money for her. Then her ears caught up with the words memory charmed, and for a moment she felt outraged. There was no point if she couldn't keep the memories. What sort of girl did Professor Snape think she was? "You surely know," said Severus Snape, "of Miss Hermione Granger, the Sunshine General." "What?" said Ryan Felthorne in sudden horror and disgust. "She's in her first year. You." 72. SAR, plausible deniability, PT 7. The winter sun had well set by the time dinner ended, and so it was amid the peaceful light of stars, twinkling down from the enchanted ceiling of the great hall, that Hermione left for the Ravenclaw Tower, alongside her study partner Harry Potter, who lately seemed to have a ridiculous amount of time for studying. She hadn't the faintest idea of when Harry was doing his actual homework, except that it was getting done, maybe by house elves while he slept. Nearly every single pair of eyes in the whole hall lay on them as they passed through the mighty doors of the dining room, which were more like siege gates of a castle than anything students ought to go through on the way back from supper. They went out without speaking and walked until the distant babble of student conversation had faded into silence, and then the two of them went on a little further through the stone corridors before Hermione finally spoke. "Why'd you do that, Harry?" "Do what?" said the boy who lived in an abstracted tone, as if his mind were quite elsewhere, thinking about vastly more important things. "I mean, why didn't you just tell them no?" "Well," Harry said, as their shoes pattered across the tiles, "I can't just go around saying no every time someone asks me about something I haven't done. I mean, suppose someone asks me, 'Harry, did you pull the prank with the invisible paint?' And I say no, and then they say, 'Harry, do you know who messed with the Gryffindor Seeker's broomstick?' And I say, I refuse to answer that question. It's sort of a giveaway. And that's why," Hermione said carefully, "you told everyone." She concentrated, remembering the exact words. "That if hypothetically there was a conspiracy, you could not confirm or deny that the true master of the conspiracy was Salazar Slytherin's ghost, and in fact, you wouldn't even be able to admit the conspiracy existed, so people ought to stop asking you questions about it." "Yep," said Harry Potter, smiling slightly. "That'll teach them to take hypothetical scenarios too seriously. And you told me not to answer anything. They might not believe you if you deny it," said Harry. "So it's better to say nothing, unless you want them to think you're a liar." "But," Hermione said helplessly, but now people think I'm doing things for Salazar Slytherin. The way the Gryffindors had been looking at her, the way the Slytherins had been looking at her, it goes along with being a hero," Harry said. "Have you seen what the Quibbler says about me?" For a brief second, Hermione imagined her parents reading a newspaper article about her, and instead of the story being about her winning a nationwide spelling bee or any of the other ways she'd imagined getting into the papers, the headline said, "Hermione Granger gets Draco Malfoy pregnant." It was enough to make you think twice about the whole heroine business. Harry's voice turned a bit more formal. "Speaking of which, Miss Granger, how goes your latest quest?" "Well," said Hermione, "unless the ghost of Salazar Slytherin really does show up and tell us where to find bullies, I don't think we're going to have much luck." Not that she was sorry about that. She glanced over at Harry and saw the boy giving her a peculiarly intense look. "You know, Hermione," the boy said quietly, as though to make sure that nobody else in the world heard, "I think you're right. I think some people get a lot more help than others in becoming heroes. And I don't think that's fair either." and Harry grabbed at her witch's robes where they lay over her arm, and hustled her into a side hall of the corridor they were walking through, her mouth gaping open in surprise, even as Harry's wand came into his hand. They rounded a curve of the side hall, and it was so narrow that it was almost pushing her and Harry into each other, even as Harry pointed to the way they'd come and softly said, "Quietus." Then a moment later in the other direction, "Quietus," again. The boy looked searchingly around them, not just to every side, but even upward toward the ceiling and down toward the floor. And then Harry stuck a hand in his pouch and said, "Invisibility cloak." "Gleep," said Hermione. Harry was already drawing out folds of shimmering black fabric from the moleskin device. "Don't worry," the boy said with a small grin. "They're so rare that nobody bothered to make a school rule against them." And then Harry held out the dark velvet mesh to her and said, his voice strangely formal, "I do not give you, but loan you my cloak unto Hermione Jean Granger. Protect her well." She stared at the shimmering velvet of the cloak, cloth that swallowed all the light that fell on it, except what glinted from small, strange reflections. Fabric so perfectly black it should have shown dust, or lint, or something, but it didn't. The longer you looked, the more you felt like what you were seeing wasn't really there at all. But then you blinked again, and it was just a black cloak. "Take it, Hermione." Hardly even thinking, Hermione stretched out her hand to grasp the fabric. And then just as her brain woke up and she started to pull her hand back, Harry let go of the cloak, and it started to fall, and she grabbed at it without thinking. And the instant her fingers touched and held the cloak, she felt an intangible jolt run through her like picking up her wand for the first time. And it was like she heard a song being sung, ever so faintly, in the back of her mind. "That's one of my quest items, Hermione," Harry said softly. "It belonged to my father, and it's not something I can replace if it's lost. Don't loan it to anyone else, don't show it to anyone, don't tell anyone it exists. But if you want to borrow it for a while, just come to me and ask." Hermione finally tore her eyes loose from the depthless black folds and stared back up at Harry. "I can't." "You certainly can," Harry said. "Because there's nothing even the tiniest bit fair about my finding this gift trapped in a box next to my bed one morning, and you not." Harry paused thoughtfully. "Unless you did get your own invisibility cloak, in which case never mind." Then the implications of invisibility cloak finally dawned on her, and she pointed a shocked finger at Harry, though they were close enough together that she couldn't quite straighten her arm properly, and her voice rose with considerable indignation as she said, "So that's how you disappeared from the potions closet. And the time when—" And then she trailed off, because even with an invisibility cloak, she still couldn't see how Harry had. Harry buffed his fingernails on his robes with artful nonchalance and said, "Well, you knew there had to be some trick to it, right? And now the heroine will mysteriously know where and when to find bullies, just like she listened to the bullies planning it, even though nobody her age could possibly have turned herself invisible to spy on them." There was a pause and a silence. "Harry," she said, I'm not sure anymore that fighting bullies is such a good idea." Harry's eyes stayed steady on hers. "Because the other girls might get hurt." She nodded, just nodded. "That's their choice, Hermione, just like it's yours. I decided not to do the obvious stupid thing that everyone does in books, try to keep you safe and protected and helpless, and have you get really angry at me and push me away while you go off on your own and get into even more trouble, and then heroically pull through it successfully, after which I'd finally have my epiphany and realize that blah 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 etc. I know how that part of my life story goes, so I'm just skipping over it. If I can predict what I'm going to think later, I might as well go ahead and think it now. Anyway, my point is, you shouldn't smother your friends to keep them safe, either. Just tell them up front it's predictably going to go horribly wrong, and if they still want to be heroines after that, fine. It was at times like this that Hermione wondered if she was ever going to get used to the way Harry thought. "Harry, I really," her voice stuck for a second, really don't want them getting hurt, especially because of something I started." "Hermione," Harry said seriously, "I'm pretty sure you did the right thing. I don't see what could realistically happen to them that would be worse for them in the long run than not trying." "What if they get badly hurt?" Hermione said. Her voice felt blocked in her throat. She remembered Captain Ernie saying how Harry had just stared straight into the eyes of a bully as the bully bent his finger back, before Professor Sprout had arrived to save him. And there was another thought that came after that, about Hannah and her delicate hands with the fingernails that she carefully painted in Hufflepuff yellow every morning. But that wasn't allowed to be imagined. Then they'll never do anything courageous, ever again. I don't think it works like that, Harry said steadily. Even if it all goes mind-bogglingly wrong, I don't think it works like that inside a human mind. The important thing is believing about yourself that you're someone who can break your boundaries. Trying and getting hurt can't possibly be worse for you than being stuck. What if you're wrong, Harry? Harry paused for a moment, and then shrugged a little sadly and said, "What if I'm right?" Hermione looked back at the black mesh running over her hand. From the inside, the cloak felt strangely soft and yet firm against her palm, as if it was trying to give her hand a reassuring hug. Then she lifted her arm back up, holding the cloak back to Harry. Harry didn't move to take it. Said Hermione. I mean, thank you a lot, but I'm still thinking about it, so you can take it back for now. And Harry, I don't think it's right to spy on people, not even on known bullies, to rescue their victims, Harry said. I've never been bullied, but I've been through a realistic simulation, and it didn't feel very pleasant. Have you ever been bullied, Hermione? No, she said in a quiet voice, and went on holding out Harry's invisibility cloak to him. Finally, Harry took back his cloak. She felt a small twitch of loss as the inaudible song vanished from the back of her mind and started to stuff the black material back into his pouch. As the pouch ate the last of the fabric, Harry turned from her to break the quieting barrier. And, Hermione said, that's not the cloak of invisibility, is it? The one we read about in the library on page 18 of Paula Vieira's translation of Gottschalk's an illustrated scroll of lost devices. Harry turned his head back, grinning slightly, and said in exactly the same tone of voice he'd used earlier with the other students at dinner, I cannot confirm or deny that I possess magical artifacts of incredible power. When Hermione climbed into bed that night, she was still trying to decide. Her life had been simpler at dinner time, back when there hadn't been any practical way for them to find bullies, and now she had to choose again, not for herself this time, but for her friends. In her mind's eye, she kept seeing Dumbledore's lined face and the pain it hadn't quite hidden, and in her mind's ears, she kept hearing Harry's voice saying, that's their choice, Hermione, just like it's yours. And her hand kept remembering the sensation of the cloak against her fingers, replaying it over and over in her mind. There was a power to the feeling that compelled her thoughts to return to it, and to the song she'd heard, hadn't heard in a part of her mind, and magic which now lay silent once more. Harry had spoken to the cloak like it was a person, telling it to take good care of her. Harry had said the cloak had belonged to his father, that he couldn't replace it if it was lost. But Harry wouldn't really do that, would he? Just hand her one of the 3 Deathly Hallows created centuries before Hogwarts. She could say that she felt flattered, but this went way beyond feeling flattered into making her wonder just what she was to Harry exactly. Maybe Harry was the sort of person who went around loaning ancient, lost magical artifacts to anyone he considered a friend. But when she thought about which part of his life Harry had said he'd skipped over, the part where he tried to keep her safe and protected, Hermione stared up at the ceiling of the Ravenclaw dorm. Somewhere beyond her bed, Mandy and Sue were talking. She turned up her quieting charm to where she couldn't hear the exact words, but could still hear their faint murmur. There was something comforting about sleeping in a dorm with the other girls. Harry kept his own quieter turned up all the way, she knew. She was starting to wonder if maybe Harry actually did well. You know, like her. It took Hermione Granger a long time to fall asleep that night. And when she woke up the next morning, there was a small slip of parchment peeking out from under her pillow which said at 10:30, you will find a bully in the 4th passageway, to the left of the hall leaving the potions classroom. When Hermione entered the great hall that morning, her stomach was filled with flying butterflies the size of hippogriffs. Even as she approached the Ravenclaw breakfast table, she still hadn't decided what to do. There was an empty place next to Padma, she saw. That would be where to sit down if she was going to tell Padma, and then ask Padma to tell Daphne and Tracy. Hermione walked toward the empty place next to Padma. There were words waiting in her throat, Padma. I got a mysterious message, and she could feel a huge brick wall inside her, stopping the words from coming out. She'd be putting Hannah and Susan and Daphne in danger, taking them and leading them by the hands straight into trouble. That was wrong. or she could just go try to handle the bully herself without telling her friends anything, and that, quite obviously, was also wrong. Hermione knew she was being faced with a moral dilemma, just like all those wizards and witches she'd read about in stories. Only in stories people always got a right choice and a wrong choice, not two wrong ones, which seemed a bit unfair. But she had the sense, somehow. Maybe it came from the way Harry always talked about how the history books would see them, that she was faced with a heroic decision, and that her whole life might end up going one way or another, depending on what she chose right now, this morning. Hermione sat down at the table without looking to either side, just gazing at the plate and silverware like they might have answers hidden inside, thinking as hard as she ever had. And a few seconds later, she heard Padma's voice whispering almost in her ear. Daphne says she knows where a bully's going to be at 10:30 today. Doomed. They were all doomed, in Susan Bones's opinion. Auntie sometimes told stories which started out like this, people doing something they knew was stupid, and the stories usually ended with someone being doomed all over the floor and all over the walls, and getting on Auntie's shoes. "Hey, Padma," muttered Parvati, her voice just barely audible over the soft impacts of 8 girls tiptoeing through the corridor leading to the potions classroom. "Do you know why Hermione's been sighing all morning? No talking," hissed Lavender, the harsh whisper sounding much louder than Parvati's mutter. "You never know when evil might be listening." "SHHH," said 3 other girls even more loudly. Utterly, totally, quite extremely doomed. As they approached the 4th passageway to the left of the potions classroom, where Daphne's mysterious informant had said the bullying would take place, the 8 of them moved slower, the sound of their feet got softer, and finally General Granger made the gesture that meant halt. "I'll look ahead." Lavender raised a hand then, and when Hermione turned to look at her, Lavender, looking puzzled, pointed straight down the corridor, gestured to herself, and then tried to sign something else that Susan didn't understand. General Granger shook her head, and once again, this time with slower, more exaggerated movements, made the sign for halt. "I'll look ahead." Lavender, looking even more puzzled, pointed back the way they'd come, and made a bouncing gesture with her other hand. Now everyone else was looking even more confused than Lavender, and Susan thought with some acerbity that evidently 1 hour of practice done 2 days ago wasn't enough to remember a new set of code signals. Hermione pointed at Lavender, then at the floor beneath Lavender's feet, the expression on her face making it very clear that the intended meaning was you. "Stay. Here." Lavender nodded. "Doom, doom, doom," went the words of the Chaos Legion's marching song through Susan's mind. "Doom, doom, 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 doom." Hermione reached into her robes and drew out a little rod with a mirror on the end of it and an eyepiece. Very, very softly indeed, the Ravenclaw girl crept up to the wall, right next to where the passageway opened off the corridor, and peeked just the tip of the eyepiece around the corner. Then a little more. Then a little more. Then General Granger cautiously stuck her head around the side. General Granger turned back to them, nodded, and made the hand gesture for "follow me." Susan felt a little better as she crept forward. The part of the plan which called for them to arrive 30 minutes before the bully had, apparently, actually worked. Maybe they were only slightly doomed. At 10:29, almost on the dot, the bully showed up. If anyone had been present to hear, though the corridor was apparently empty, they would have heard his shoes clicking solidly through the main corridor, entering the passageway, walking toward where the passageway turned its first corner, turning that corner, and then stopping in some surprise upon seeing that the passageway now terminated in a solid brick wall where no wall had been before. Then the bully shrugged and turned away as he leaned back to watch the main passage from just around the corner. It was the castle Hogwarts, after all. Behind the hastily transfigured thin panels they'd assembled into the outward appearance of a brick wall, the girls waited, not speaking, not moving, hardly even breathing, but watching through the eye-holes they'd left themselves. As Susan's gaze took in the bully, she could feel the tightening of her chest all the way into her toes. The boy looked to be in his 7th year, if not older, and his robes were trimmed in green instead of the red they'd been hoping for, and he had muscles, and after staring for a bit longer, Susan realized his stance had the balance that meant that he dueled. Then they all heard the sound of more feet approaching from the corridor. The 4th-year Gryffindors and Slytherins had just been let out of potions class. The footsteps pattered past, and diminished and faded, and the bully didn't do anything. For a moment Susan felt an instant of relief. Then another, smaller group of footsteps approached. The bully still didn't do anything as the footsteps went past. That happened a few more times. And then, as there approached the faintly audible sound of one last set of footsteps, the 7 girls heard the bully's voice saying, clear and cold and quiet, "Pratigo." Someone did gasp then, though fortunately very, very quietly. If they couldn't get in even a single shot. The bullies were learning already, Susan realized. She hadn't expected SPHEW to be able to do this very often before the bullies caught on. But Hermione had already defeated 3 bullies, and the school had been buzzing with speculation about Salazar Slytherin's ghost. Yesterday, he's expecting us. Susan would have whispered to give up, to abort the plan, only there was no way to convey a message to Silencio, said the bully in a soft, deliberate voice with his wand pointed toward the corridor, the blue haze of his shielding charm shimmering around him. Akio victim. When the 4th-year boy came into their field of vision, he was dangling upside down, as if an invisible hand were holding him high by one leg, his red-trimmed robes beginning to slide down his thighs to reveal the pants beneath. His mouth was opening and closing helplessly, no sound coming out. "I suppose you're wondering what's going on," the 7th-year Slytherin said in a quiet, cold voice. "Don't worry, it's so simple even a Gryffindor could understand." With that, the Slytherin's left hand formed a fist and drove hard into the Gryffindor's belly. The 4th-year boy's body jerked around frantically, but still no words left his mouth. "You're my victim," said the older Slytherin. "I'm a bully. I'm going to beat you up. And we'll see if anyone stops me." It was at that moment that Susan realized it was a trap, and in almost the same moment there rang out the mighty and high-pitched voice of a young girl, crying, "Stop, evildoer, finite incantatum." Lavender, thought Susan, agonized. The Gryffindor girl had volunteered to be a distraction, while the rest of them executed a flank attack from where the bully wouldn't expect it. That had been the plan, only now, in the name of Hogwarts, cried Lavender's voice, though they couldn't see her, and in the name of heroines everywhere, I command you to let go of that eek. Expelliarmus, said the bully. Stupefy, Akio, stupid heroine. When Lavender floated into their vision, dangling by one foot and unconscious, Susan blinked. The girl was dressed in a bright crimson and gold skirt and blouse, instead of her usual Hogwarts robes. The bully was also giving the girl's upside-down body an odd look, and then he pointed his wand at her and said, "Finite incantatum," but the clothes stayed the same. Then the bully shrugged, and still facing in the direction of Lavender instead of the dangling 4th-year boy, drew back his fist. "Lagan," yelled 5 voices, and 5 green spirals blasted from 5 wands aimed through 5 holes in the false wall, and an instant later Hermione's voice shouted, "Stupefy." 5 green spirals shattered ineffectually on blue haze, and Hermione's red bolt bounced off the haze and struck the 4th-year boy, who jerked and then was still. And the 7th-year bully turned around, smiling grimly, as the 1st-year girls screamed and charged. Susan's eyes flew open, and instantly she was rolling away from where she'd lain on the floor, her lungs still on fire, and her whole body still aching from when she'd been hit. The battle had only moved forward a few seconds from what she could see. Hannah's body falling with her arms still stretched out towards Susan. "Glissio," shouted Hermione, but the older boy just slashed his wand down, leaving a trail of green glow behind, and Hermione's charm visibly disrupted into a shower of blue-white sparks. Then in almost the same motion the bully said, "Stupefy," and Hermione was blown backward, and Susan summoned up all the magic she had left and shouted, "Innervate." At Hermione's body, even as the bully turned toward her, the bully's wand pointed in her direction again, and then Padma yelled, "Prismatis." Just before the bully shouted, "Impedimenta." The rainbow sphere forming around the bully, and the 7th-year Slytherin staggered as his own hex was reflected back at him. But an instant later, the bully's wand swept back to tap himself, and then Padma's prismatic sphere shattered like a blown soap bubble as the bully's wand cut through it, and "Innervate," yelled Parvati at Hannah's body, and Tracy and Lavender screamed at the same time, "Wingardium Leviosa." Hannah Abbott held out her wand with a hand that trembled with exhaustion. She didn't have enough magic left for even one Innervate now. The rest of the passageway was silent, scattered bodies lying across the ground. Padma and Tracy and Lavender, Hermione and Parvati in a heap against one wall. Susan standing in petrified rigor as her eyes tracked it all helplessly. Even the Gryffindor boy lying sprawled and motionless. Hermione had woken him and he'd fought, but it hadn't been enough. It had been a very short battle. The bully was still smiling, the only signs of his exertion a wavering ripple in the blue glow surrounding him and a few beads of sweat on his forehead. The bully raised his arm, wiped the sweat off his forehead, and stalked toward her like a man-shaped living letterfold. Hannah turned and fled, spun and ran with screams kept bound in her choking throat, sprinted past the fallen paneling of the fake brick wall, ran down the passageway with all the speed she could muster, weaving as much as she could. Just before Hannah got to the turn in the passageway, the bully's voice from behind her said, "Cloth." She got awful cramps all through her legs. She fell down and slid and hit her head against the wall, only she didn't even notice the pain of the smack as she started to scream with the twisting muscles. The bully was still stalking toward her. Hannah saw as she turned her head, approaching her slowly, still wearing that dreadful smile. And she rolled, despite the pain as her leg muscles knotted up around themselves. She rolled around the corner of the passageway and screamed, "Go away." "I think not," said the bully, his voice deep and scary like that of a grown man, sounding very close at hand now. The bully walked around the corner, and Daphne Greengrass stabbed her most ancient blade directly into his groin. There was a flash that lit up the whole corridor. It was with a subdued mien that 7 girls left Madame Pomfrey's office, leaving one of their own behind in a hospital bed. Hannah would be all right in about 35 minutes, the healer had said. Torn muscles were easy to mend. Daphne had done all the talking, and according to her, Hannah had suffered a mishap with a road-running charm which had caused the leg cramps. Madame Pomfrey had given them a sharp look, but hadn't argued, even though that charm was around 6 years above their level. Madame Pomfrey had also given Daphne a potion to help with her state of total magical exhaustion, and warned her not to cast any spells for the next 3 hours. That, supposedly, was from Daphne using up too much magic trying to finite Hannah, rather than the most ancient blade drawing out all of her power to break the Protego. The rest of them had decided not to say anything about the bruises under their robes until they could get some older girls to cast a pisky. There were limits to what Daphne could talk around. The whole thing, Susan thought, had been too close, much too close. If the bully had so much as looked around the corner, if he'd taken a moment to recast his shielding charm, "We should stop," said Susan, as soon as the 7 of them had gotten out of hearing range of the healer's office. "We should stop doing this." For some reason, then, even though they were supposed to vote on this sort of thing, everyone turned to look at General Granger. The Sunshine General didn't seem to see them looking at her. She just strode on, gazing off straight ahead. After a little while, Hermione Granger said, in a voice that sounded thoughtful and a little sad, "Hannah said she didn't want us to stop. I'm not sure it's right for us to be less brave for her than she is." All the other girls, except Susan, nodded at that. "I think that's got to be as bad as it gets," said Parvati. "And we can handle it. We've proved that now." Susan couldn't think of anything to say to that. She didn't think that shrieking at the top of her lungs about blatant stupidity and doom would be persuasive, and she couldn't just leave the other girls either. Wasn't it enough to be cursed with hard work? Why did Hufflepuffs have to be loyal on top of everything else? "By the way, Lavender," said Padma, "what in the name of Merlin's underpants were you wearing back there?" "My hero outfit," said the Gryffindor girl. Daphne sounded weary as she spoke without turning her own head from where she was plodding through the hall. "It's the costume of the soldier of Gryffindor from the play Chronicles of the Lunarian Soldiers." "Did you transfigure it?" said Parvati, looking puzzled. "But the bully cast finite on you." "Nope," Lavender said. "It's real. See, I just transfigured my hero outfit into a regular shirt and skirt beforehand, so all I had to do was cast finite on myself after I saw the bully." "Do you want your own, Parvati? I got mine made yesterday by Katerina and Joshua in 6th year for 12 sickles. I think," General Granger said in a careful voice, "that would make us all look a little silly." "Well," said Lavender, "we should vote on whether to." "I think," General Granger said, "that no matter what anyone votes, I'm not going to be caught dead wearing one of those costumes. Susan ignored the argument. She was trying to think up some sort of clever strategy for being less doomed. The whole great hall went silent, even if only for a moment, as the seven of them walked into lunch. Then the applause started. It was scattered, not the massive applause of everyone applauding at once. A lot of it came from the Gryffindor table, less from Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw, and none from Slytherin. Daphne felt her face tightening. She'd hoped, well, maybe after they found a Gryffindor bully to stop and a Slytherin to rescue, her fellow Slytherins would realize. She looked at the Hufflepuff table. Neville Longbottom was applauding with his hands held high above his head, although he wasn't smiling. Maybe he'd heard about Hannah, or maybe he was wondering why Hannah wasn't there. Then, not quite able to help herself, she glanced toward the head table. Professor Sprout's face was lined with concern. She and Professor McGonagall were leaning their heads toward Headmaster Dumbledore, who had a solemn look, and all their lips were moving quickly. Professor Flitwick looked more resigned than anything else, and Quirrell, face slack, was taking trembling stabs at his soup using a spoon gripped in a fist. Professor Snape was looking directly at her, or at Hermione Granger, standing next to her. A small, thin smile crossed the potions master's face, and he raised his hands, brought them together once in a motion that was too slow to be a real clap, and then the potions master turned back to his plate, ignoring the conversations around him. Daphne felt a little chill go down her spine, and she hastily turned to walk toward the Slytherin table. Susan and Lavender and Parvati peeled off from their group, heading toward the Hufflepuff and Gryffindor tables on the other side of the Great Hall. It happened as they were passing the part of the Slytherin table where the Slytherin Quidditch team sat. That was when Hermione stumbled suddenly, stumbled hard like she was being yanked off her feet, and went sprawling into the gap between where Marcus Flint and Lucian Bowles sat, and there was a sad little splutching sound as Hermione's face ended up in Flint's plate of steak and mashed potatoes. Everything seemed to happen too quickly then, or maybe it was just Daphne herself who was thinking too slow, as Flint let out a bellow of indignation, and his hand yanked Hermione back and threw her into the Ravenclaw table, and she bounced off a student's back and collapsed onto the ground. The quiet spread out in ripples. Hermione pushed herself up on her hands, though she didn't get all the way to her feet. Daphne could see that her whole body was shaking, and that her face was still covered with mashed potatoes with scattered pieces of steak. For a long moment, nobody spoke, nobody moved. Like nobody in the whole great hall could imagine, any more than Daphne could, what happened next. Then Flint's powerful voice, the voice of the Slytherin captain that bellowed commands on the Quidditch pitch, said in a dangerous rumble, "You ruined my food, girl." Another moment of frozen silence. Hermione's head, Daphne could see it trembling, turned to look at the Slytherin Quidditch captain. "Apologize to me," said Flint. Harry Potter started to push himself up from the Ravenclaw table, and then stopped abruptly, halfway to his feet, as if he'd just thought of something. Then 5 other people stood up from the Ravenclaw table. All of the Slytherin Quidditch team stood up, their wands coming into their hands, and then students stood up at the Gryffindor table, and at the Hufflepuff table, and without thinking, Daphne turned to look at the head table, and she saw that the headmaster was still sitting down. Watching, just watching. Dumbledore was just watching, and he had one hand out, as though to restrain Professor McGonagall. In just 1 second, someone would shout a spell, and then it would be too late. I wasn't the headmaster doing anything, and a voice said, "My apologies." Daphne turned back to look, her mouth gaping open in absolute shock. "Scourgify," said that smooth voice, and the mashed potatoes vanished from Hermione's face, revealing the Ravenclaw's surprised expression as Draco Malfoy approached her, sheathed his wand again, and then knelt to one knee beside her and offered her a hand. "Sorry about that, Miss Granger," said Draco Malfoy's polite voice. "I guess someone thought they were being funny." Hermione took Draco's hand, and Daphne suddenly realized what was about to happen, but Draco Malfoy didn't raise Hermione halfway up and then drop her. He just pulled her to her feet. "Thanks," said Hermione. "You're welcome," Draco Malfoy said in a loud voice, not looking to either side to see where all 4 houses of Hogwarts were staring at him in total shock. "Just remember, being cunning and ambitious doesn't mean you have to be like that." And then Draco Malfoy went back to his seat at the Slytherin bench and sat down like he hadn't Hermione went to the nearest empty place at the Ravenclaw bench and sat down. A number of other people, rather slowly, sat down. "Daphne," said Tracy, "are you all right?" Draco's heart was hammering in his chest, so hard he worried it might explode right out of his chest in a shower of blood, like that curse Amicus Caro had used once on a puppy. Draco's face stayed completely controlled, because he knew it had been drilled into him over and over, that if he showed the slightest sign of the fear he was feeling, his housemates would rip him apart like a swarm of acromantulas. There'd been no time to check with Harry Potter, no time to plot, no time to think, just the instant of realizing that the time to start rescuing Slytherin's reputation was right then. From all sides of the long Slytherin table, angry faces stared at Draco. But they were outnumbered by the faces that just looked puzzled. "All right, I give up," said a sixth-year boy that Draco didn't recognize, sitting across from him and 2 places to his right. "Why did you do that, Malfoy?" Although his mouth was very dry, Draco didn't swallow. That would have been a sign of fear. Instead, he took a bite of carrots, which had the most moisture of anything on his plate, and chewed and swallowed, thinking as rapidly as he could. "You know," Draco said, making his voice as cutting as he could, as his heart thumped even harder in his chest, as everyone around him stopped talking to listen, "there's probably some way to make Slytherin look even worse than attacking 8 first-year girls from all 4 houses who are working together to stop bullies. But I can't think of how. This way we get the benefit of what Greengrass is doing." The puzzled faces stayed puzzled. "What?" said the 6th-year boy. "And wait, what benefit?" said a 5th-year girl sitting to his right. "It makes Slytherin House look better," said Draco. The Slytherins around him were giving him quizzical gazes like he'd just tried to explain algebra. "Look better to who?" said the 6th-year boy. "But you just helped a mudblood," said the 5th-year girl. "How's that supposed to look good?" Draco's throat closed up. His brain was experiencing a hideous malfunction, during which it couldn't think of anything to say except the truth. Then, "It's probably some kind of tremendously clever scheme Malfoy's got going," said a 5th-year boy. "You know, like in the Tragedy of Light, where everything that looks like a setback is part of the plot, and it ends with Granger's head on a stick and nobody suspecting that it was him." "That makes sense," someone said from further down the table, and there was a lot of nodding. "Do you know what the boss is up to?" Vincent muttered in an undertone. Gregory Goyle didn't reply. In his mind he could hear very clearly his master's voice, saying, "I can't believe I believed every word of that," the day the rumor had started about Salazar Slytherin showing Potter and Granger where to find bullies. "Mr. Goyle," whispered Vincent. Gregory Goyle's lips shaped the words, "Oh no," but no sound came out. Hermione had left lunch early that day. For some reason she hadn't felt hungry. Those few seconds of horrible humiliation had kept burning through her mind, over and over, the feeling of her face squishing into the mashed potatoes and then being thrown through the air, and then the Slytherin's boy's voice saying, "Apologize to me." It might have been the first time in her whole life that she'd felt like hating someone. The boy who'd thrown her Marcus Flint, they'd said his name was, and whoever had cast the tripping jinx on her in the first place. She'd felt it. For one horrible instant she'd wanted to go tell Harry that if he started getting creative on her behalf, she wouldn't object. She hadn't been a minute out of the great hall before she'd heard the sound of running feet behind and turned to see Daphne racing toward her, and listened to what her sunshine soldier had to say. "Don't you understand?" Daphne's voice was barely below a shriek. "Just because someone's nice to you doesn't mean they're your friend. He's Draco Malfoy. His father's a Death Eater. All the parents of all his friends are Death Eaters. Not Goyle, Crabbe, everyone around him. Do you get it? They all despise Muggle-borns. They want everyone like you to die. They think you're good for nothing but being a sacrifice in horrible dark rituals. Draco is the next Lord Malfoy. He's been raised from birth to hate you, and he's been raised from birth to lie." Daphne's grey-green eyes stared fiercely at her, demanding assent and understanding. "Here," Hermione said falteringly. She remembered the rooftop, the awful jolt as she started to fall, Draco Malfoy's hand grabbing hers and holding it so hard that she'd had bruises afterward. She'd had to tell him twice before he finally let her fall. "Maybe Draco Malfoy isn't like them." Daphne's whisper was almost a scream. "If he doesn't end up doing you 10 times as hard as he just helped you, his life is over, do you understand? I mean, Lucius Malfoy would literally disinherit him. Do you know what the chance is that he's not up to something?" "Tiny," said Hermione in a small voice. 0, hissed Daphne. I mean none. I mean less than 0. I mean the chance is so small that you couldn't find it with 3 magnifying charms and a point-me spell and an ancient map and a centaur prophet. Everyone in Slytherin knows he's plotting to do something to you and doesn't want to be suspected. I heard someone say he was seen pointing his wand at you just before you tripped, don't you see? This is all part of Malfoy's plan. Draco sat eating his steak with roasted cauliflower florets and ashwender sauce. It wasn't made from real ashwender eggs. It just tasted like fire, trying not to laugh and trying not to cry. He'd heard about plausible deniability, but hadn't realized how much it mattered until he found that Malfoy's didn't have any. You want to know my plot, said Draco. Here's my plot. I'm not going to do anything, and then the next time people think I'm plotting something, they won't be sure. Ha, said the fifth-year boy. I don't think I believe you. That doesn't sound cunning enough to be really it. That's what he wants you to think, said the fifth-year girl. Albus, Minerva said dangerously, did you plan all this? Well, if I did snap my fingers under the table, I wouldn't just tell you that. The defense professor's quavering hand dropped his spoon into the soup again. What do you mean, set you up? Said Millicent. The two of them were sitting cross-legged on Daphne's bed, having come there straight from the great hall after lunch. With my seer's eyes that stare through time itself, I saw you winning. Daphne stared at Millicent, her own merely mortal eyes rather narrowed at the moment. That boy was expecting us. Well, yeah, said Millicent. Everyone knows you're hunting bullies. Hannah got hit by a really painful hex, Daphne said. She had to visit a healer, Millicent. If we're friends, you should have warned me. Look, Daphne, I told you. The Slytherin girl paused, as if trying to remember something, and then said, I told you. What I see has to come to pass. If I try to change it, if anyone tries to change it, really terrible, awful, no good, extremely bad things will happen. And then it'll come to pass anyway. If I see you getting beaten up, I can't tell you that, because then you try to not go, and then Millicent stopped. And then, Daphne said skeptically, what happens if we just don't go? I don't know, said Millicent. But it probably makes being eaten by Letherfolds look like a tea party. Look, even I know that's not how prophecies work, Daphne said, then paused. At least prophecies don't work like that in plays. Admittedly, there were all sorts of tragedies where trying to avoid a prophecy made it happen, or where, on the other hand, trying to go along with a prophecy was the only reason why it happened. But you could make prophecies happen your own way if you were clever enough, or someone who loved you enough could take your place, or with enough effort it was possible to break a prophecy outright. Then again, in plays the seers never remembered what they saw either. Millicent must have seen Daphne's hesitation, because the other girl started looking a little more confident. Well, Millicent said sharply, this isn't a play. Look, I'll tell you if I see it being a hard battle or an easy one. But that's all I can do, you understand. And if I say hard, you can't not show up. Or Millicent's eyes rolled back in her head, and she intoned hollowly, those who try to cheat their destinies will come to sad and gloomy ends. Professor Sprout shook her head, her face looking tight. But, said Susan. But you helped Harry Potter that one time, and it was made quite clear to me, Professor Sprout said in a voice that sounded like someone was using a shrinking charm to squeeze her throat, that it was Professor Snape's job, and not mine, to keep order in Slytherin House, Miss Bones, please. You don't have to do this if— Yes, I do have to, Susan said unhappily. I'm a Hufflepuff. We have to be loyal. A mysterious parchment under your pillow, said Harry Potter, looking up from where he was sitting in the quieted nook where they were studying. Then the boy's green eyes narrowed. It wasn't from Santa Claus, was it? Pause. Okay, said Hermione. Not going to ask, and you're not going to tell me, and we're both going to pretend you never said that, and I don't know anything about it. Susan approached the table as soon as the older girl was alone, glancing around the Hufflepuff common room to make sure nobody was watching, the way Auntie had taught her to do it, so that it wouldn't be obvious that she was looking. Hey, Susie, said the seventh-year Hufflepuff. Do you already need more? Can I please talk to you privately for a bit? Susan said. James Astorga, seventh year of Slytherin, and until recently considered a promising upstart on the youth dueling circuit, stood ramrod straight in Professor Snape's office, with his teeth clenched tight and sweat trickling down his spine. I distinctly recall, said the head of his house in a sardonic drawl, That I warned you, and a number of others this very morning, that there were certain first-year girls who might prove annoying if a fighter were incautious and allowed himself to be taken by surprise. Professor Snape stalked in a slow circle around him. "Aye," said James, as more sweat beaded on his forehead. He knew how ridiculous it sounded, how much of a pathetic excuse. "Sir, they shouldn't have been able to. One first-year girl shouldn't have been able to break his protego. No matter what sort of ancient charm she used, Greengrass must have had help. But it was very clear that his head of house wouldn't believe that." "Oh, I quite agree," murmured Snape in a low tone, instinct with menace. "Shouldn't have. I begin to wonder if Mr. Malfoy, whatever his plotting, has a point, Astorga. It cannot be good for the repute of Slytherin's house if our fighters, rather than demonstrating their strength, lose to little girls." Snape's voice had risen. "It is well that you had the good taste to be defeated by a little girl who is a fellow Slytherin of a noble house, Astorga, or I would deduct points from you myself." James Astorga's fists clenched at his side, but he couldn't think of a thing to say. It was some time before James Astorga was allowed to leave the presence of his head of house, and afterward only the walls, the floor, and the ceiling saw Severus Snape's smile. That evening Draco was visited by his father's owl, Tanaxu, who wasn't green, but only because there weren't such things as green owls. The best father had been able to find was an owl of the purest silver feathers, with great luminous green eyes, and a beak as sharp and cruel as any snake's fang. The parchment wrapped around Tanaxu's leg was short and to the point. "What are you doing, my son?" The parchment that Draco sent back was equally short, and it said, "I am trying to stop harm done to Slytherin's reputation, father." In as much time as it took for an owl to fly from Hogwarts to Malfoy Manor and back again, the family owl bore another message to Draco, and this one said only, "What are you really doing?" Draco stared at the parchment he'd unwrapped from the owl's leg. His hands trembled as he held up the parchment to the light of his fireplace. 5 words, carved in black ink, shouldn't have been scarier than death. There wasn't very much time to think. Father knew exactly how long it took for a message to go from Malfoy Manor to Hogwarts and back again. He would know if Draco delayed to compose a careful lie. But Draco still waited until his hands stopped trembling before he wrote his reply, the only answer he'd thought of that father might accept. "I am preparing for the next war." Draco wrapped that parchment around the owl's leg and tied it, and then sent Tanaxu winging out from his room through the halls of Hogwarts into the night. He waited, but no reply came. 73. Sa, the Sacred and the Mundane, PT 8. The red jet of fire took Hannah full in the face, flipping her end over heels and smacking her head straight into the stone wall, where her pale face seemed to linger for an instant, framed by flying strands of brown-golden hair, before she collapsed to the ground in a heap of robes, as the third and final volley of blazing green spirals brought down their foe's shield charm. The March days marched by, filled with lectures and study and homework, breakfast and lunch and dinner. The Gryffindor boy stared at the 8 of them, tension in every line of his body's frame, his face working soundlessly, and then his hands released their clenched grasp on the Slytherin boy's lapels, and he walked away without anyone saying a word. Well, Lavender almost said a word. Her mouth was just opening in indignation, maybe because she hadn't gotten a chance to declaim her speech. But luckily, Hermione spotted it and made the gesture that meant shut up. Then there was sleeping, of course. You wouldn't want to forget about sleeping just because it seemed so normal. "Enervate," said the young voice of Susan Bones, and Hermione's eyes flew open, and her lips drew in air with a gasp, her lungs feeling heavy like there was a huge weight resting on her chest. Beside her, Hannah was already sitting up, holding her head in her hands and grimacing. Daphne had warned them that this would be a hard fight, creating a certain trepidation in Hermione, and indeed in all of them. Except maybe Susan, who'd just shown up at the appointed meeting time and walked alongside them without speaking, and fought the 7th-year bully until she was the last girl standing. Maybe the Gryffindor had been reluctant to fight the last daughter of Bones, or maybe Susan had just gotten very lucky. At any rate, when Hermione had tried to sit up again, she'd realized that her chest had felt heavy because there was, in fact, a rather large body sprawled on top of her. And you wouldn't want to forget about magic either, even if the actual moment of casting a spell only formed a very small part of your day. It was the whole point of Hogwarts, after all. "Okay, How about if we all ride around on skateboards? Said Lavender. We could get places faster than walking. And we'd look really awesome on skateboards. Muggle artifacts may not be as fast as broomsticks, but they look cooler. We should vote on it. As for the remaining fractions of time, you would fill that according to your nature. Gossip about upper-year romances, or books and study sessions. Hermione reached out a trembling hand to grasp her copy of Hogwarts. A history from where it had fallen, the ever-comforting book only a pace distant from where she herself had ended up on the floor, after the red-robed upper-year girl had bumped her into a wall. And then the older Gryffindor witch had walked away without a look back, only a whispered Salazar's, and a word that hurt her more than anything the Slytherins said about mudbloods. Mudblood was just a strange, wizarding word, but Hermione knew the word the Gryffindor had said. She couldn't get used to it. She just couldn't get used to being hated. It still hurt just as much every time it happened, and somehow it hurt even more coming from the Gryffindors who were supposed to be the good ones. Harry had divided up 8 of his soldiers among the other armies, as ordered. He'd voluntarily given up 2 chaotic lieutenants, sending Dean Thomas to Dragon Army, and then trading Seamus Finnegan to her for Blaise Zabini, who Harry had said was being underutilized in Sunshine. Lavender had elected to join most of Sfew in Sunshine. Tracy had decided to stay with Chaos. So you can work your charms on General Potter, said Lavender, as Hermione ignored both of them as hard as she could. I've got to say, Tracy's, I think our Sunshine General has him pretty well sewn up by now. You'd have better luck convincing Hermione that the 3 of you should have one of those, arrangements. Nobody had figured out yet what Draco Malfoy was plotting. Certain, said Harry Potter, sounding rather reluctant. You know a rationalist isn't ever certain of anything, Hermione, not even that 2 and 2 make 4. I can't actually read Malfoy's mind, and if I could, I couldn't be certain he wasn't a perfect accumens. All I can say is that based on what I've seen of Malfoy, it's a lot more plausible than Daphne Greengrass thinks that he actually is trying to show the Slytherins a better way. We really should try to go along with that, Hermione. Well, Harry seemed to think Draco Malfoy was a good guy, but then the trouble was that Harry also tended to trust people like Professor Quirrell. Professor Quirrell, Harry said, I'm worried about the hatred Slytherin house seems to be developing for Hermione Granger. They were sitting in the defense professor's office, Harry sitting far back from the teacher's desk, and the sense of pending disaster was still noticeable, even then, the empty bookcase still framing Professor Quirrell's balding head. Cup balanced on Harry's thigh was filled with Professor Quirrell's obscure, probably expensive Chinese tea, and it said something about the way Harry had been thinking lately that he'd needed to make a conscious decision to drink it. And this concerns me for what reason? Said Professor Quirrell, sipping his tea. Yes, well, said Harry. I'm just going to ignore that. Oh, stop that, Professor Quirrell. You've been plotting to restore Slytherin House's reputation since at least the first Friday of this year. There might have been a tiny crack of a smile at the edges of those thin, pale lips, and then again, there might not have been. I think Slytherin's house will do well enough in the end, Mr. Potter, regardless of the fate of one girl. But I do agree that the present outlook is not favorable for your little friend. The bullies of 2 houses, many of them with powerful and well-connected families, see Miss Granger as a threat to their reputation and a shame to their pride. As powerful a motive as that is to hurt her, it pales compared to the raw envy of the Gryffindors, who see an outsider gaining the laurels of heroism which they have dreamed of since childhood. Now the smile on Professor Quirrell's lips was definite, though slight. And then there are those of Slytherin House who hear that Salazar Slytherin's ghost has abandoned them to favor a mudblood. I wonder if you can even conceive, Mr. Potter, of how such as they would react. Who do not believe it would cheerfully kill Miss Granger for the insult. And as for those Slytherins who wonder deep down, in some quiet place within themselves, if it might perhaps be true, their inner panic is something scarcely to be contemplated. Professor Quirrell sipped his tea equably. When you are more experienced, Mr. Potter, you will see such consequences in advance of your plotting. As it stands, you are being ill-served by your willful ignorance of all human nature you deem unpleasant. Harry sipped his own tea. Ah, said Harry. Professor Quirrell, help. I already offered Miss Granger my help, said Professor Quirrell, as soon as I foresaw what would develop. My student told me in polite terms to stay out of her business, nor would she tell you anything different, I expect. As I have little to truly gain or lose in this matter, I hardly intend to press the point." The defense professor shrugged, his teacup held steady in the exactly right polite grip, so that the surface of the liquid did not even ripple as Professor Quirrell leaned back within his chair. "Do not worry too much, Mr. Potter. Emotions run high around Miss Granger, but she is in less danger than you might imagine. When you are older, you will learn that the first and foremost thing which any ordinary person does is nothing." The envelope which the Slytherin system had delivered to Daphne at lunch was unsigned, as always. The parchment within named a time and a place, and said, simply, "Hard." That wasn't what had concerned Daphne. What had concerned Daphne was that Millicent didn't seem to be looking in her or Tracy's direction at lunch that day. She just stared straight ahead at her plate and eaten. Millicent had looked up just once that Daphne saw, in the direction of the Hufflepuff table, and then looked quickly back down again, though Daphne was too far away to see the expression on Millicent's face, since Millicent had sat down far away from her and Tracy. Daphne had thought about that during lunch, with a sick feeling in her stomach, unlike anything she'd felt before, and which had caused her to stop eating halfway through her first plate. What I see has to come to pass. It probably makes being eaten by Letherfolds look like a tea party. It wasn't any conscious decision that Daphne made, nothing like Slytherins were supposed to do, no weighing of the benefits to herself. Instead, Daphne told Hannah and Susan and everyone that her informant had warned her that the next bully was going to target Hufflepuffs in particular, and that the bully planned to risk the teacher's wrath in order to really hurt either Hannah or Susan, like seriously, and the two of them needed to stay out of this one. Hannah had agreed to stay out of it. Susan had. "What are you doing here?" yelled General Granger, though it was sort of a yell and a whisper at the same time. Susan's round face didn't change, like the Hufflepuff girl had suddenly developed the sort of experienced blankness that Daphne's own mother used. "Am I here, really?" Susan said calmly. "You said you wouldn't come." "Did I say that?" said Susan. She flipped her wand casually in one hand, leaning against the stone wall of the corridor where they were waiting, her reddish-brown hair somehow arranging itself in perfect order against the yellow trim of her witch's robes. "I wonder why. Maybe I didn't want Hannah to get any strange ideas. Hufflepuff loyalty, you know. If you don't leave," said the Sunshine General, "I'll call a mission abort, and we'll all go back to our study halls, Miss Bones." "Hey," said Lavender. "We didn't vote on." "That's fine by me," said Susan, who was keeping a steady gaze on the other end of the corridor where it merged into the tiled hallway where they'd been told to expect the bully. "I'll just stay here myself then." "Why?" said Daphne. Her heart was in her throat. "If I try to change it, if anyone tries to change it, really terrible, awful, no good, extremely bad things will happen, and then it'll come to pass anyway." "Why are you doing this?" "It's not like me," said Susan. "I know," but Susan shrugged. "People don't always behave like themselves, you know." They pleaded. They begged. Susan didn't even say anything anymore. She just kept watching, waiting. Daphne was nearly crying. She kept wondering if she'd caused this, if trying to change fate was making this happen worse. "Daphne," said Hermione, her voice sounding much higher than usual, "go get a teacher. Run." Daphne spun on her heels and started to pelt down the other direction of the stony corridor, and then she realized, and she turned back to where all the other girls except Susan were watching her go, and Daphne, feeling like she was about to throw up, said, "I can't." "What?" said Hermione. "I think it gets worse every time you try to fight it," said Daphne. That was how it worked in plays sometimes. Hermione stared at her, and then Hermione said, "Padma." The other Ravenclaw girl just tore right out of there without arguing. Daphne watched her go, knowing that Padma wasn't as good a runner as her, and now wondering if maybe that would turn out to be the only reason why help would come too late. "Bullies are here," Susan said laconically. "Ha, they've got a hostage." They all whirled and looked, and saw three older bullies. Daphne's eyes recognized Reese Belker, who was a top lieutenant in one of the seventh-year armies, and Randolph Lee, who was number 2 in the Hogwarts dueling club, and worst of all, Robert Jugson Roman III in his 6th year, whose father was almost certainly a Death Eater. All three were surrounded by shielding charms, blue hazes that glowed beneath the surface in ribbons of other color and showed occasional faceting above. multi-layered shields like the three of them thought they were fighting serious duelists and had expended energy accordingly. And behind them, bound and supported by glowing ropes, was Hannah Abbott. Her eyes were wide and panicked, and her mouth was moving, though they couldn't hear anything through the quietus they'd put up earlier. Then Jugson made an offhand gesture with his wand, and the glowing ropes flung Hannah at them. There was a small pop as Hannah's body blew through the quieting barrier. Susan's wand was instantly pointing at Hannah, and Susan's voice muttered, Wingardium Leviosa. "Run!" screamed Hannah, as she was gently lowered to the ground. But the corridor behind them and in front of them was now blocked with a glowing grey field, a barrier spell that Daphne didn't recognize. "Do I need to explain what this is about?" Lee said with false joviality. The seventh-year duelist was sporting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, just in case, you little inconveniences, and that includes you, Miss Greengrass, you've been quite enough trouble, and you've told quite enough lies. We brought your little friend just to make sure everyone knew we got all of you, though I suppose the other Ravenclaw girl is hiding around a corner or clinging to the ceiling somewhere. Well, no matter. This is your enough talk," said Robert Jugson Roman III. "Time for pain," and raised his wand. "Cloth." Simultaneously, Susan pointed her wand and said, "Prismates," and a small rainbow sphere formed in midair almost instantly, the miniature barrier so condensed and bright that it stayed intact even as Jugson's hex hit it and bounced off toward Belka, whose wand flashed to swat away the dark bolt. And then a moment later the many-colored blaze was gone. Daphne's eyes went wide for a moment. She'd never thought of using a prismatic sphere like that. "Jugsy, honey," said Belka. Her lips widened in a vicious smile. "I thought we discussed this. First we beat them, then we play." "Pete, please," said Hermione Granger in a faltering voice. "Let them go. I promise I'll—" "Oh, really?" said Lee in an annoyed tone. "Are you about to offer to turn yourself over if we let the others go? We've got all of you now." Jugson smiled then. "It could be funny," said the sixth-year junior Death Eater, softly and with menace. "How about if you lick my shoes, Mudblood, and one of your friends can go? Pick whichever one you like best. Leave the others to get hurt." "Nope," said the young voice of Susan Bones. "Not going to happen." And with a blindingly fast motion, the Hufflepuff girl leapt leftward just as a red stun-bolt erupted from Belka's wand. Daphne could hardly see the movement as Susan seemed to hit the corridor wall and then bounce off it like she was a rubber ball, and her legs smashed into Jugson's face. It didn't go through the shield, but the sixth year went sprawling backward with the impact, and Susan followed him downward, and her foot stamped down on the boy's wand arm, again being repelled by the shield. "Elmikia," shouted Lee, and Parvati shouted, "Prismates." And the rainbow wall formed, but the fiery blue blast passed right through it like it wasn't even there. The bolt missed Susan by inches. There was a whirlwind of motion that Daphne couldn't follow, during which Belka had her feet knocked out from under her. But the older witch just rolled back to a stand, and then Daphne saw it coming, and her lips started to mouth, "Pris," but it was already too late. 3 blasts of brilliance slammed into Susan at once. She had her wand raised as though she could counter them, and there was a white flash as the hexes struck the magical wood. But then Susan's legs convulsed and sent her flying into a corridor wall. Her head hit with a strange cracking sound, and then Susan fell down and lay motionless with her head at an odd-seeming angle, her wand still clutched in one outstretched hand. There was a moment of frozen silence. Parvati scrambled over to where Susan lay, pressed a thumb over the pulse point on Susan's wrist, and then slowly, tremblingly, Parvati rose to her feet, her eyes huge. "Vitalis Revelio," said Lee just as Parvati opened her mouth, and Susan's body was surrounded by a warm red glow. Now the seventh-year boy really was grinning. "Probably just a broken collarbone, I'd say. Nice try, though." "Merlin, they are tricky," said Jugson. "You had me going for a second there, dearies." The seventh-year girl wasn't smiling at all. "Tanya!" screamed Daphne, raising her wand above her head and focusing harder than she ever had in her life. "Rava Calvaria, Lucis." She didn't even see the hex that got her. Hermione felt the jolt of innovation bringing her awake, and out of some intuitive stratagem, she didn't roll to her feet right away. It had been a completely hopeless battle, and she didn't know what she could do, but some instinct told her that leaping to her feet wasn't it. Just a crack. Hermione opened her eyes, and the thin rays of light that entered them showed Parvati backing away from all three bullies, the last girl standing that Hermione could see. And her eyes also showed Tracy fallen not far away from her, and Hermione's wand was still in her hand. And so, desperately hoping the slithering girl would show more sense than she usually did, Hermione made the wand movements as subtly as she could, and hardly moving her lips, whispered, "Innervate." Hermione felt the spell working, but Tracy didn't move. Hermione hoped it was because Tracy was being cunning and waiting to. What could they do? Hermione didn't know, and the panic that had waited through the moments of fighting was starting to eat her up inside now that she was still, now that she was trying to think, now that she could see that it was all absolutely hopeless. That was when Hermione heard a thud, and though it was out of her field of vision now, she knew that Parvati had fallen. A moment of silence came and passed. "Now what?" said the voice of the scary soft boy. "Now we wake up the mudblood," said the precise voice of the scary formal boy, "and find out who's really behind them, not Salazar Slytherin's ghost." "No, dears," said the voice of the scary sweet girl. "First we bind them all very securely." And then there was a sound like lightning and thunder, and Hermione's eyes widened in shock before she could stop herself. And in her widened field of vision, she saw the scary soft boy convulsing as yellow arcs of energy crawled over him like giant blazing worms. His wand flew out of his hand as he collapsed to the ground, twitching, and then a moment later he lay still. "Is everyone else asleep now?" said a voice. "Good." Susan Bones rose from the floor near where the scary soft boy had stood, neck still oddly bent. Then she rolled her head around her shoulders, a casual loose motion, and her head was straight again. The round-faced first-year girl stood facing the remaining two bullies with one hand cocked on her hip, grinning, and surrounded by faceted blue haze. "Polyjuice," spat the bully girl. "Polyflues reverso," roared the remaining boy bully. Something like the form of a mirrored scarf spat out of his wand, passed without resistance through the haze surrounding Susan. For an instant, she glowed in a strange mirror color, like a reflection of herself, and then the glow faded. The young girl still stood there, hand on her hip. "Wrong," said Susan. "And this is the truth," said Susan. In case nobody ever told you, in her small hand, a wand rose up, blurred by the blue haze surrounding it. "You don't mess with the puffs," said Susan, and with a grey flash so bright it hurt Hermione's half-closed eyes, the real battle started. It went on for a while. Some of the ceiling got melted. The girl bully tried to cry a truce, that they would leave and take Jugson with them, and Susan roared out the syllables of a curse Hermione recognized as Abidalsum's horrid wilting, which was illegal in 7 countries. Eventually the girl bully lay unconscious and unawakenable on the ground, and the last boy bully had fled, leaving his companions' bodies behind, and Susan was leaned over against one wall, covered in sweat, and her scorched robes soaked through with wet spots, gasping for breath, and clutching at her right shoulder using her left hand. After a while, Susan straightened up and turned to look back at where her fellow witches were sleeping on the floor. Well, they should have been sleeping on the floor. Lavender was already sitting up with eyes as wide as watermelons. "That," said Lavender. "Was," said Tracy. "What?" said Hermione. "I mean what?" said Parvati. "Cool," said Lavender. "Oh, hell," said Susan Bones. Her face had already looked a little pale beneath the sweat, and now it was getting paler, looking almost frighteningly white. "Ah, could I convince you that you hallucinated all that?" There was a rapid exchange of glances. Hermione looked at Parvati. Parvati looked at Lavender. Lavender briefly locked gazes with Tracy. The 4 of them looked back at Susan and shook their heads. "Oh, hell," said Susan again. "Look, I'll be back in a few minutes, but I've really got to go now. Please don't say anything. Bye." And Susan ran out into the hallway, moving surprisingly fast, before anyone could say another word. "No, seriously, what?" said Parvati. "Innervate," said Hermione, pointing her wand at Daphne, whose body she hadn't been able to see before, and Lavender pointed her wand at Hannah's body and said the same. Hannah's eyes opened, and she tried frantically to roll to her feet, but collapsed to the ground halfway through. "It's okay, Hannah," said Lavender. "We won." "We what?" said Hannah from her little heap on the floor. Daphne hadn't stirred, but Hermione could see her chest rising and falling, and the breathing rhythm looked normal enough. "I think she's okay," said Hermione, but she took a moment to swallow. Her mouth was still dry. This had all gotten way out of hand. I think we ought to take Daphne to Madame Pomfrey's. Sure, sure, just give me a second here and I'll probably be fine, said Parvati. Excuse me, Hannah said in a tone that was polite but firm. How did we win, and why does the ceiling look all melty? There was a pause. Susan did it, said Tracy. Yeah, said Parvati, voice only slightly shaky as she stood up and started to brush off her red-trimmed robes. It turns out that Susan Bones is the heir of Hufflepuff, and she's opened up the long-lost entrance to Helga Hufflepuff's chamber of hard work and practice. Ha, said Hannah, who was feeling over herself as if to make sure all her body parts were still there. I thought that was just something Professor Sprout says to teach us an important moral lesson. Susan is. Slowly, Hermione was beginning to feel a bit more together. It hadn't really been more than 30 seconds of extreme terror, at least not the parts she'd been conscious for. Actually, Hermione said carefully as her mind started to work again, I'm pretty sure that is just something Professor Sprout says. It wasn't in Hogwarts, a history, or anywhere else I've read. She's a double witch, shouted Tracy, her voice so high it cracked. She is. She's one of them. She's been this whole time. What? Yelled Parvati, twisting around to look at Tracy. That is the looniest thing, of course, said Lavender, now all the way on her feet and starting to bounce up and down with excitement. I should have realized. Susan's a what? Said Hermione. A double witch, said Tracy. You see, said Lavender, speaking very rapidly, there've always been stories about these children who are born as super magicians who can cast spells no one else can, and there's a whole secret school hidden inside Hogwarts with classes that only they can see and go to. Those are just stories, yelled Parvati. That's not how real life works. I mean, sure, I read those books too. Just a minute, please, said Hermione. Maybe her mind was feeling a little slow after all. You mean even though you already get to go to a magical school and everything, you still want to go to a double magical school? Lavender looked at her, puzzled. What? Said Lavender. Who wouldn't want to have super extra magical powers? It would be like this whole amazing destiny and everything. It'd mean you were special. Hannah nodded to that, looking up from where she'd crawled to Daphne's side and was checking the girl for broken bones. I wish I was a double witch, Hannah said, and then, sounding a little sadder, though I don't believe there is any such thing really. What did you see Susan do exactly? I mean, are you sure you weren't just seeing things after getting stunned? Hermione truly couldn't find any words at this point. Oh no, said Tracy. The slithering girl spun around to look at the entrance to the corridor, her robes fluttering around her. Oh no, we've got to get out of here. We've got to get away before Susan comes back with someone who can super memory charm us. Susan wouldn't do that, said Parvati. I mean, if there even was, what's going on here? Roared a high-pitched, squeaky voice as Professor Flitwick stormed into the partially melted corridor like a small, dangerously compressed package of pure academic fury, an ashen-faced Padma gasping along behind him. What happened? Susan blurted to the girl who looked exactly like her, except for the scorched robes damp with sweat. Ooh, great question, said the other Susan Bones, as she rapidly skinned off what was left of her borrowed clothes. A moment later, the girl began to metamorphose back into her more accustomed form of Nymphadora Tonks. Sorry, but I couldn't think of anything myself, so you've got about 3 minutes to decide on an answer to that, as Daphne Greengrass observed afterward with some acidity. The flaw in Hermione's cunning plan to make sure that house points were taken evenly from all 4 houses if they got caught was that it didn't work on detentions. They'd all agreed to keep their mouths shut about Susan's mysterious powers. Even Tracy, after Susan threatened to have her super memory charmed if she didn't promise. Unfortunately, they discovered at dinner time that someone had forgotten to tell the bullies about their agreement, and also that Susan Bones had sacrificed her soul to dreadful forbidden powers, which now inhabited the hulk of her body, and that was why they'd all gotten detention. Hermione, Harry Potter said to her from beside her at the dinner table, his voice very tentative. Please don't take offense, and I'll understand if you say it's none of my business, but I think all this is starting to spin out of control. Hermione went on mashing the slice of chocolate cake on her plate into a seamless mush of cake and icing. Yes, Hermione said. Her voice might have been a little acerbic. That was what I said to Professor Flitwick while I was apologizing to him, that I knew things had gotten out of hand, and he yelled, Really, Miss Granger, do you think? In a squeak so loud that my ears caught on fire. I mean, my ears actually caught on fire. Professor Flitwick had to put them out again. Harry had put his hand to his forehead. Excuse me, Harry said. His face was perfectly straight. Sometimes I still have a little trouble getting used to that sort of thing. Hey, Hermione, remember when we were young and naive, and we still thought the world was a relatively understandable place? Hermione put her fork down and looked at him for a moment. Do you sometimes wish you were a muggle, Harry? Ha, said Harry. Well, of course not. I mean, even if I was a muggle, I'd probably have tried someday to take over the Warrelal, as Hermione gave him a look, and the boy hastily swallowed the word and said, I mean optimize, of course. You know, that's what I really mean, Hermione. My point is, it's not like my goals would change one way or another. But with magic, it's going to be a lot easier to get things done than if I had to do stuff using only the Muggle capability set. If you think about it logically, that's why I'm going to Hogwarts instead of just ignoring all this and studying for a career in nanotechnology. Hermione, having finished handcrafting her chocolate cake sauce, began to dip her carrots in it and eat them. Why do you ask? Said Harry. Do you wish you were back in the Muggle world? Not exactly, Hermione said, as she crunched into both the carrot and the chocolate. I was just, well, feeling strange about having wanted to be a witch. Did you want to be a wizard when you were little? Of course, Harry said promptly. I also wanted psychic powers and super strength and adamantium-reinforced bones and my own flying castle, and sometimes I felt sad that I might have to settle for just being a famous scientist and an astronaut. Hermione nodded. You know, she said softly, I think the witches and wizards who grow up here don't really appreciate magic properly. Well, of course they don't, Harry said. That's what gives us our advantage. Isn't that obvious? I mean, seriously, that was bloody obvious to me within 5 minutes of walking into Diagon Alley. There was a puzzled look on the boy's face, like he couldn't understand why she was paying attention to something so ordinary. 74. SAR, Escalation of Conflicts, PT9. Harry walked forward a step, then another step, until a sense of unease began to pervade him, a disquiet in his nerves. He said nothing, lifted no hand. The pervading sense of unease would say it for him. From behind the closed door of the office came a whisper, carrying through the door as though no door were present. It is not my office hours, said that cold whisper, nor yet the time of our meeting. I take 10 Quirrell points from you, and be glad it is not more. Harry stayed calm. Going through Azkaban had recalibrated his scale of emotional disturbances, and losing a house point, which had formerly rated 5 out of 10, now lay somewhere around 0.3. Harry's voice was likewise level as he said, You made a testable prediction, and it was falsified, Professor. I only wish to note that. As Harry turned to go, he heard the door opening behind him, and he swung back around in some surprise. Professor Quirrell was leaning back in his chair, his head lolling back against its rest, as a parchment floated before him. Both the defense professor's hands rested limply on the desk, as though nerveless. He might have been a corpse, excepting that the ice-blue eyes still moved, back and forth, back and forth. The parchment vanished, and was replaced by another so quickly it was like the material had only flickered. Then the lips moved as well. And from this, whispered the lips, you infer what, Mr. Potter? Harry was shaken by the sight, but his voice stayed even as he said that ordinary people do not always do nothing, and that Hermione Granger is in more danger from Slytherin House than you thought. The lips curved, ever so barely. So you think I have failed in my grasp of human nature. But that is hardly the only possibility, boy. Do you see the other? Harry furrowed his brows as he stared at the defense professor. I tire of this, the defense professor whispered. You will stand there until you see it for yourself, or else leave. As though Harry had stopped existing, the defense professor's eyes looked back to the parchment, once more scanning back and forth. It was 6 parchments later that Harry saw it, and said out loud, You think your prediction failed because there was some other factor at work which was not in your model. Some reason why Slytherin House hates Hermione more than you realized. Like when the orbital calculations for Uranus were wrong, and the problem wasn't in Newton's laws, it was that they didn't know about Neptune. The parchment vanished, and was not replaced. The head rose from its lolling position then, facing Harry more directly, and the voice which issued forth was quiet, but not toneless. I think, boy, Professor Quirrell said softly, but in something approaching his normal voice, that if all Slytherin House hated her so much, I would have seen it. And yet 3 formidable fighters of that house did something rather than nothing, at risk and at cost to themselves. What force could have moved them or willed their motion? The icy blue glitter of the defense professor's eyes met Harry's own gaze. Some hand possessed of influence within Slytherin, perhaps. Then how would that hand have benefited itself by harm done to the girl and her followers? Said Harry. It would have to be someone threatened by Hermione somehow, or someone who would get the credit if she was hurt. I don't know anyone who fits that profile, but then I don't know much about anyone in Slytherin outside first year. The thought was also coming to Harry that deducing a hidden mastermind from a single mildly unexpected attack seemed like insufficient evidence to support the prior improbability of the theory. But then it was Professor Quirrell who was doing the deducing. The defense professor was just looking at Harry, eyelids slightly lowered as though in impatience. "And yes," said Harry, "I am sure that Draco Malfoy isn't behind it." A hiss of outward air like a sigh. "He is the son of Lucius Malfoy, trained to the most exacting standards. Whatever you have seen of him, even in what seem to be unguarded moments when his mask slips, and you trust that you have seen the truth beneath, even that may all be part of the face he chooses to show you." Only if Draco successfully cast the Patronus charm as part of keeping up the act. But Harry didn't say that, of course. Instead, he just grinned slightly and said, "So either you've really never read Draco's mind, or that's just what you want me to think." There was a pause. One of the hands turned over, beckoned a finger. Harry stepped into the room. The door closed behind him. "That was not something you should have said aloud in human speech," said Professor Quirrell's soft voice. "Legilimency on Malfoy's heir. Did Lucius Malfoy learn of it, he would have me assassinated outright." "He would try," Harry said. It should have won a crinkle of Professor Quirrell's eyes, but the defense professor's face was unmoving. "But sorry." When the defense professor spoke again, his voice had once more become a cold whisper. "I suppose I could, and pity the assassin." His head fell back against the chair, lolled to one side, the eyes no longer meeting Harry's. "But these small games hardly hold my interest as they stand. Add legilimency, and it ceases to be a game at all." Harry hardly knew what to say. He'd seen Professor Quirrell in an angry mood once or twice before, but this seemed emptier, and Harry didn't know what to say to it. "What's bothering you, Professor Quirrell?" He could not ask. "What does hold your interest?" Harry said a few moments later, after he'd worked it out as a safer-seeming strategy for redirecting Professor Quirrell's attention to positive things. Citing experimental results about keeping a gratitude journal as a strategy for improving life happiness didn't seem like it would be taken well. "I will tell you what does not hold my interest," said that icy whisper. "Grading ministry-mandated essays does not hold my interest, Mr. Potter. But I have undertaken the position of defense professor at Hogwarts, and I will see it through to its end." Another parchment appeared in front of Professor Quirrell's head, and his eyes began to scan it. "Reese Belker held a high position in my armies before her folly. I will offer her the chance to stay rather than being expelled if she tells me exactly of the forces which moved her, and I shall make clear to her what will happen if she lies. I do permit myself to read faces." The defense professor's finger pointed past Harry, toward the door. "But whether you were wrong about human nature," Harry said, "or whether there's some extra force at work in Slytherin House, either way, Hermione Granger is in more danger than you predicted. Last time it was 3 strong fighters, so what happens after? She wishes not my help nor yours," said a soft, cold voice. "I no longer find your concerns so entertaining as I once did, Mr. Potter. Go." Somehow, even though they were all equals, and she definitely wasn't in charge, it was always Hermione who ended up speaking first in this sort of situation. The 4 tables of Hogwarts, the 4 houses having breakfast, were glancing over at where they, the 8 members of SPHEW, had gathered off to one side. Professor Flitwick was also staring sternly at all of them from the head table. Hermione wasn't looking there, but she could feel Professor Flitwick's gaze on the back of her neck. Literally feel it. It was really creepy. "Why'd you tell Tracy you wanted to talk to us, Mr. Potter?" said Hermione, her tone crisp. "Professor Quirrell expelled Reese Belker from her army last night," Harry Potter said, "and from all her other after-school defense activities. Do any of you see the significance of that? Miss Greengrass, Padma." Harry's eyes swept over them as Hermione exchanged a puzzled glance with Padma, and Daphne shook her head. "Well," Harry said quietly, "I wouldn't actually expect you to. But what it means is that you're in danger, and I don't know how much danger." The boy squared his shoulders, looking straight into Hermione's eyes. "I wasn't going to say this, but I just wanted to offer to put you under whatever protection I could give, make it clear to everyone that anyone who messes with you is messing with the boy who lived." "Harry," said Hermione sharply. "No, I don't want. Some of them are my friends too, Hermione." Harry didn't take his eyes from hers. "And it's their decision, not yours. Padma, you told me that I owed you no debt for what I did, and that's the sort of thing a friend would say." Hermione broke her gaze from Harry to look at where Padma was shaking her head. "Lavender," Harry said, "you fought well in my army, and I'll fight for you if you wish it." "Thank you, General," Lavender said crisply. "I mean Mr. Potter. No, though. I'm a heroine and a Gryffindor, and I can fight for myself." There was a pause. "Parvati," Harry said. "Susan, Hannah, Daphne, I don't know any of you so well, but it's something I would offer anyone who came to ask it of me, I think." One by one, the other four girls shook their heads. Hermione realized what was coming then, but she didn't see a single thing she could do about it. "And my loyal soldier, chaotic Tracy," said Harry Potter. "Really?" gasped Tracy, oblivious to the stabbing glares that Hermione and every other girl were directing at her. Tracy's hands flew artfully to her cheeks, though she didn't actually manage to blush, not that Hermione could see, and her brown eyes were, if not shining, at least opened very wide. "You do that for me?" I mean, of course, absolutely, general chaos." And so it was on that very morning that Harry Potter went over to the Gryffindor table, and then the Slytherin table, and told both houses that anyone who hurt Tracy Davis, regardless of what she was doing at the time, would, quote, learn the true meaning of chaos, unquote. It was with considerable restraint that Draco Malfoy managed to prevent himself from slamming his head repeatedly into his plate of toast. They weren't exactly scientists, the bullies of Hogwarts, but even they, Draco knew, were going to want to test it. The Society for the Promotion of Heroic Equality for Witches hadn't announced it. It didn't seem like it would do any good to announce it. But they had all quietly decided, or, in the case of Lavender, been shouted into it by all 7 other girls, to take a break from fighting bullies for a while, at least until their heads of house weren't looking at them quite so sharply anymore, and older students had stopped bumping Hermione into walls. Daphne had told Millicent that they were taking a break. And so it was with some puzzlement, a few days later, that Daphne looked at the parchment delivered to her at lunch, drawn in a hand so shaky it was almost unreadable, saying, "To this afternoon at the top of the stairs going up from the library, really important, everyone has to be there, Millicent." Daphne looked around, but she couldn't see Millicent anywhere in the great hall. "A message from your informant," said Hermione, when Daphne told her. "That's odd. You didn't what?" said Daphne, after the Ravenclaw girl had stopped in mid-sentence. The Sunshine General shook her head and said, "Listen, Daphne, I think we need to know where these messages come from before we keep following them. Look at what happened last time. How could anyone have known where those 3 bullies would be unless they were in on it?" "I can't say," Daphne said. I can't say anything, but I know where the messages come from, and I know how anyone can know." Hermione gave Daphne a look that, for a moment, made the Ravenclaw girl look scarily like Professor McGonagall. "Aha," said Hermione. "And do you know how Susan suddenly turned into Supergirl?" Daphne shook her head and said, "No, but I think it might be really important that if we get a message saying we should be somewhere, everyone has to be there." Daphne hadn't seen what had happened with Susan after Daphne had tried to avert the prophecy by keeping Susan away. But she'd been told about it afterward, and now Daphne was afraid that she might possibly have broken something. "Aha," said Hermione, who was doing the McGonagall stare again. Nobody seemed to know where it had started, who had started it. If you tried tracing it afterward, tracked it back word by word and mutter by mutter, you probably would have found it all going in a huge circle. Peregrine Derrick was tapped on his shoulder as he left potions that morning. James Storger heard a whisper in his ear at lunch. Robert Jugson Roman III discovered a tiny folded note under his plate. Carl Sloper overheard 2 older Gryffindors whispering about it, and they gave him significant glances as they walked past. Nobody seemed to know where the word began, or who had first spoken it, but it named the place, and it named the time, and it said that the color would be white. Every single one of you had better be absolutely clear on this, said Susan Bones. The Hufflepuff girl, or whatever strange power had possessed her, wasn't even pretending to act normal anymore. The round-faced girl was striding through the halls with a firm, confident gait. If we get there, and it's just one bully, that's fine. You can fight them the regular way. My mysterious superpowers won't activate if there are no innocents in danger. But if 5 seventh-year bullies jump out of a closet, you know what you do. That's right. You run away and let me fight them. Finding a teacher is optional. The important thing is that you run away as soon as I create an opening. In a fight like that, you are liabilities. You are civilian targets I have to worry about protecting. So you will get away as fast as possible, and you will not try to do anything heroic, or so help me. The hour you get out of your healers' beds, I will personally show up and kick your asses right back in. Are we all clear on that? Yes, squeaked most of the girls, though in Hannah's case it came out, yes, Lady Susan. Don't call me that, snapped Susan. And I don't think I heard you, Miss Brown. I'm warning you, I have friends who write plays, and if you do anything dumb, posterity will remember you as Lavender, the amazing, stupid hostage. Hermione was beginning to worry about just how many other Hogwarts students, besides Harry, had mysterious dark sides, and whether she was likely to develop one if she kept hanging out with them. All right, Captain Bones, said Lavender in an unusually respectful tone, as they turned another corner along the shortest way to the library, passing through a rather large corridor studded with 6 sets of double doors, 3 sets on either side. Can I ask if there's any way for me to become a double witch? Sign up for the Aura Preparation Program in your 6th year, said Susan. It's the next best thing. Oh, and if a famous Aura offers to oversee your summer internship, just ignore anyone who warns you that he's a terrible influence or that you're almost certainly going to die. Lavender was nodding rapidly. Got it, got it. Padma, who hadn't actually been there last time, was giving Susan very skeptical looks. Then Susan suddenly stopped in place, and her wand snapped up and she said, Protego Maximus. A jolt of adrenaline went through Hermione. She was instantly drawing her wand and spinning around, but she couldn't see anything wrong through the greater blue haze now surrounding them all. The other girls, who had likewise pulled into formation, were also looking puzzled. Sorry, said Susan. Sorry, girls. Give me a moment to check this place out. Thinking of a certain person has just reminded me that this hall we're in right now, with all those doors, would be an excellent place for an ambush. There was a moment of silence. Now, said a harsh male voice, blurred into unidentifiability by a buzzing undertone. All 6 sets of double doors slammed open. White robes filed silently forward, all concealing white robes without marks of house affiliation and white cloth hiding the faces beneath the hoods. They marched out and marched out, crowding the great corridor in numbers too high to count easily. Less than 50 robes, probably, certainly more than 30, all of them already surrounded by blue haze. Susan said some extremely bad words, so awful that at almost any other time Hermione would have noticed. That message, Daphne cried in sudden horror. It wasn't from Millicent Bulstrode, said the voice in its buzzing undertone. No, it wasn't. You see, Miss Greengrass, if the same girl sends off a Slytherin message every day you fight a bully, pretty soon someone else will notice. We'll have a talk with her after we're done with you. Miss Susan, said Hannah in a voice just starting to quaver, can you be super enough to wands rose in many hands? There came a series of blinding flashes of green light, a massive volley of shield breakers, at the end of which there was no more protective blue dome surrounding them, and Susan had fallen to her knees, clutching her head. Barriers of solid blackness had sprung into being at both ends of the corridor. Behind the double doors that Hermione could see into, there were only unused classrooms, very dead ends. No, said the male voice with that buzz overlaid. She can't. In case you haven't noticed, you've gotten quite a lot of people very angry at you, and we have no intention of losing this time. All right, everyone, prepare to fire. The wands around the perimeter aimed again, low enough that their enemies wouldn't hit each other if they missed. And then another male voice, with a similar buzz accompanying it, suddenly said, Hominem Revelio. An instant later, there was another massive volley of shield breakers and hexes, fired on reflex at the suddenly revealed figure, shattering the shields which had almost immediately begun to form around it. And then, as that same figure fell to the ground, a stunned silence. "Professor Snape," said the second voice. "He's the one who's been interfering." It was the potions master of Hogwarts who now lay unconscious on the stone floor, the dirt-spotted robes stirring for a final moment before they settled in place, his fallen hand outstretched toward where his wand was slowly rolling away. "No," said the first male voice, now sounding a bit more uncertain. Then it rallied. "No, that can't possibly be it. He heard us passing the word, of course, and came along to make sure nobody screwed it up again. We'll wake him up afterward and apologize, and he'll memory charm the children so they don't remember. He's a professor, so he can do that. Anyway, we should make sure we're really alone now. Veritas oculum." Fully 24 different charms must have been spoken then, but no more invisible people showed up. One of them in particular made Hermione's heart sink. She recognized it as the charm which had been listed alongside the description of the true cloak of invisibility, which would not reveal the cloak, but would tell you whether it or certain other artifacts were nearby. "Girls," whispered Susan. She was slowly pushing herself to her feet, though Hermione could see her limbs swaying and quivering. "Girls, I'm sorry for what I said before. If you've got anything clever and heroic to try, you might as well try it." "Oh, yeah," Tracy Davis said then, her voice trembling. "I almost forgot." The Slytherin girl raised her voice and spoke. "Hey, all of you," yelled Tracy in a high-pitched, shaky shout. "Hey, are you planning to hurt me too?" "Yes, actually," said the buzzing voice of the leader. "We are. I'm under Harry Potter's protection, you know. Anyone who tries to hurt me will learn the true meaning of chaos. So are you going to let me go?" It should have sounded defiant. It came out sounding terrified. There was a pause. Some of the hoods of the robes turned to face each other, then turned back to face the girls. Said the buzzing male voice. "No." Tracy Davis put her wand away into her robes. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her right hand high in the air and pressed her thumb and forefingers together. "Go ahead," said that voice. Tracy Davis snapped her fingers. There was a long, awful pause. Nothing happened. "Yes, well," said the voice Tracy said, her voice sounding even higher and shakier. "A Cathla, Mundatus sum." Her hand, stretching up still further, snapped its fingers a second time. A nameless chill went down Hermione's spine then, a frisson of fear and disorientation like she just felt the floor tilt beneath her, threatening to spill her into some darkness lying beneath. "What's she?" began a buzzing female voice. Tracy's face looked pale, twisted with fear, but her lips moved, spilled forth sound in a high chant, Mabra brahering Mabra. A chill wind seemed to spring up within the confines of the corridor, a dark breath that caressed their faces and touched their hands with ice. "Fire at her on my count," shouted the leading voice. 1, 2, 3. And maybe 40 voices roared spells, creating a huge concentric array of fiery bolts that lit the wide corridor brighter than the sun. For the short moment before the bolts struck and vanished upon a dark red octagon that appeared in the air around the girls, and then disappeared a moment later. Hermione saw it. She saw it, but she still couldn't imagine it. She couldn't imagine a shielding charm that powerful, a spell that would withstand an army. And Tracy's voice went on chanting, her voice sounding louder and more confident, and her face screwed up like she was trying to remember something very exactly. "Shuffle, duffle, muzzle, muff, fister, wister, mistacuff." Now all those present could feel it, heroines and bullies alike, the sensation of some dark will pressing down on them, a tingling in the air as something built and built and built. All the blue hazes around the white robes, all the shielding spells, had died out without any visible hex touching them. There were more flashes of light as more desperate spells were fired, but they fizzled out in midair like candle flames touching water. The black barriers at the two ends of the corridor had dissipated like smoke beneath the growing pressure, but their evaporation revealed the exits sealed, blocked by tiled slats of dark metal that looked stained as though with blood. And as Tracy chanted, "Lemarchand, lament, Lemarchand," a dreadful blue light began to shine out from beneath the metal slats and between them, and the 6 sets of double doors slammed, shut all at once, as panicked white-robed bullies began to pound on them and howl. Then Tracy's hand slashed to her left and she cried Corneth. Then a hand pointed below her and Slaneth, Above her, Nurgled. And then, to her right, Tzinche. Tracy paused, took a deep breath, and Hermione found her voice and cried, "Stop. Tracy, stop." But there was a strange, wild smile on Tracy's face. She raised her hand still higher and snapped her fingers a third time. And when she spoke again, beneath her high girlish voice, there was an undertone as though some lower chorus were chanting along with her. Darkness beyond darkness, deeper than pitchest black, buried beneath the flow of time. From darkness to darkness, your voice echoes in the emptiness, unknown to death, nor known to life. "What are you doing?" shrieked Parvati, and the Gryffindor girl stretched out a hand as though to pull down the Slytherin, who was now starting to float upward into the air. And both Daphne and Susan grabbed Parvati's arm at the same time, and Daphne cried out, "Don't! We don't know what will happen if the ritual is interrupted." "Well, what happens if it gets completed?" screamed Hermione, as close as she'd ever come to total brain meltdown. Susan's face was white as chalk, and she whispered, "I'm sorry, Mad-Eye." And Tracy spoke on, her body floating higher and higher off the floor, her black hair whipping wildly around her in the chill winds. "You know the gate. Who are the gate, the key and guardian of the gate? I bid you open the way for him and manifest his power before me." The corridor was plunged then into utter darkness and silence, so that only Tracy could be seen and heard, like there was nothing left in the universe except her and the light illuminating her from some nameless source. The shining girl raised her hand one final time, and with dreadful gravity pressed her thumb and forefinger together. And within the darkness, Hermione looked at Tracy's face and saw that the Slytherin girl's eyes were now, to the exact shade, the green of Harry Potter's. "Harry James Potter Evans Vares. Harry James Potter Evans Vares. Harry James Potter Evans Vares." There was a snap like thunder, and then Harry had chosen to assume a rather relaxed posture, as he sat in a low chair before the mighty desk of the headmaster of Hogwarts, one leg cocked over his knee, and his arms sprawling casually to either side. Harry was doing his best to disregard the noise from the surrounding devices, although the one directly behind him that sounded like an owl hooting desperately as it was put through a woodchipper was pretty difficult to ignore. "Harry," the old wizard said from behind the desk, the aged voice level as the blue eyes stared out at him from beneath the shining half-moon spectacles. Headmaster Dumbledore had garbed himself in robes of midnight purple, not true formal black, but dark enough to come close indeed to deadly seriousness, as the wizarding world counted the meaning of fashions. "Were you responsible for this?" "I cannot deny that my influence was at work," Harry said. The old wizard took off his glasses, leaned forward to stare at Harry directly, blue eyes to green. "I will ask you one question," the headmaster said in a quiet voice. "Do you think that what you did today was appropriate?" "They were bullies, and they came to that hallway with the direct intent of hurting Hermione Granger and 7 other first-year children," Harry said levelly. "If I am not too young for moral judgment, then neither are they. No, headmaster, they didn't deserve to die. But they did deserve to be stripped naked and glued to the ceiling." The old wizard put his glasses back on. For the first time that Harry had seen of him, the headmaster seemed to be at a loss for words. "As Merlin himself is my witness," said Dumbledore, "I haven't the faintest notion of how I ought to react to this." "That's pretty much the effect I was aiming for," said Harry. He felt like he ought to be whistling a merry tune, but unfortunately he had never learned how to whistle reliably. "I need not ask you who is directly responsible," said the headmaster. "Only 3 wizards within Hogwarts might be powerful enough. I myself did not do it. Severus has assured me he was not involved. And the third—" The headmaster shook his head in some dismay. "You loaned the defense professor your cloak, Harry. I do not think that was wise. Now that he has escaped detection by simple charms, he surely knows that it is a deathly hallow, if indeed he did not know from its first touch upon his flesh." "Professor Quirrell had already deduced my possession of an invisibility cloak," Harry said, "and knowing him, he has probably guessed that it is a deathly hallow. But in this case, headmaster, it so happens that Professor Quirrell was under one of those face-concealing white robes." There was another pause. "How very cunning," said the headmaster. He leaned back in his throne and sighed. "I have spoken to the defense professor. Just before you, indeed. I did not quite know what to say. I told him that this was not the approved Hogwarts policy for dealing with infractions of hallway discipline, and that I did not feel it was appropriate for a Hogwarts professor to do what he had done. And what did Professor Quirrell say to that? Said Harry, who was not impressed with Hogwarts's current policies for enforcing hallway discipline. The headmaster wore a look of resignation. He said, "Fire me." Somehow Harry managed not to cheer out loud. The headmaster frowned. "But why did he do it, Harry?" "Because Professor Quirrell doesn't like school bullies, and I asked very politely," said Harry. "And he was feeling bored, and I thought this might cheer him up. Either that or it's part of some incredibly deep plot." The headmaster rose up from behind the desk, began to pace back and forth before the hat stand that held the sorting hat and the red slippers. "Harry, do you not feel that all of this has gotten a bit awesome?" offered Harry. "Utterly and completely out of hand would say it better," said Dumbledore. "I am not sure there has ever been a time in the whole history of this school when things have become so. I don't have a word for this, Harry, because things have never become like this before, and so no one has ever needed to invent a word for it." Harry would have tried to invent words to express how deeply complimented he felt if he hadn't been snarkling too hard to speak. The headmaster was regarding him with increasing graveness. "Harry, do you understand at all why I find these events concerning?" "Honestly," said Harry. "No, not really. I mean, of course, Professor McGonagall would object to anything that breaks up the dull monotony of the Hogwarts school experience. But then Professor McGonagall wouldn't set a chicken on fire." The frown lines deepened on Dumbledore's wrinkled face. "That, Harry, is not what disturbs me," the headmaster said quietly. "There was a full battle fought in these halls." "Headmaster," Harry said, trying to keep his voice carefully respectful, "Professor Quirrell and I did not choose for that battle to happen. The bullies did that. We just decided to have the light side win. I know there are times where the boundaries of morality are uncertain, but in this case, the line separating the villains and the heroines was 20 meters tall and drawn in white fire. Our intervention may have been weird, but it certainly wasn't wrong." Dumbledore had gone back to his desk, sat down in his padded throne with a dull thump, and was now covering his face with both his hands. "Am I missing something here?" Harry said. "I thought you'd be secretly on our side, Headmaster. It was the Gryffindor thing to do. The Weasley twins would approve, Fawkes would approve." Harry glanced at the golden perch, but it was empty. Either the Phoenix had more important things to do, or the headmaster hadn't invited him to today's meeting. "That," said the headmaster in an old and tired and somewhat muffled voice, "is precisely the problem, Harry. There is a reason why courageous young heroes are not put in charge of schools." "All right," Harry said. He couldn't quite keep the skepticism out of his voice. "What am I missing this time?" The old wizard lifted his head, his face now solemn and calmer. "Listen, Harry," said Dumbledore. "Hear me well, for all who wield power must learn this in time. Some things in this world are, indeed, truly simple. If you pick up a stone and drop it again, the earth will be no heavier for it, the stars will not move from their paths. I say this, Harry, so that you know I am not pretending to be wise, when I tell you that even as some things are simple, others are complex. There are greater wizardries which leave marks upon the world, and marks upon those who wield them, as a simple charm would not. Those wizardries demand hesitation, consideration of consequence, a moment to weigh the meaning of their marks. And yet the most intricate magics known to me are simpler than the simplest soul. People, Harry, people are always marked by what they do and by what is done to them. Do you then understand how to say, here is the line between hero and villain? Is not enough to say that what you did was right. Headmaster, Harry said evenly, this is not a decision I made at random. No, I don't know what exact effect this will have on every single one of the bullies present. But if I always waited for perfect information before I acted, I would never do anything. When it comes to the future psychological development of, say, Peregrine Derek, beating up 8 first-year girls probably wouldn't have been good for him. And it wasn't enough to just stop them quietly and quickly, since then they would just try again later. They had to see that there was a protective power worth fearing. Harry's voice stayed level. "But of course, since I am a good guy, I didn't want to permanently injure them or even cause them any pain. And yet the penalty had to be enough to weigh on the minds of anyone thinking about trying it again. So, after weighing the expected outcomes as best I could with my boundedly rational intellect, I thought it would be wisest to strip the bullies naked and glue them to the ceiling." The young hero stared directly into the old wizard's gaze, unflinching green eyes locked with the blue behind the spectacles. And since I wasn't there and didn't do anything personally, there's no lawful way to punish me under the Hogwarts school rules. The only one who acted was Professor Quirrell, and he's fireproof. And just breaking the rules to get at me wouldn't be a wise thing to do to the hero you're grooming to fight Lord Voldemort. This time, Harry actually had tried to think through all the ramifications in advance before he'd made the suggestion to Professor Quirrell, and for once the defense professor hadn't called him a fool, just slowly smiled and then begun to laugh. "I understand your intentions, Harry," the old wizard said. "You think you have taught the bullies of Hogwarts a lesson. But if Peregrine Derek could learn that lesson, he would not be Peregrine Derek. He will only be provoked more by what you do. It is not fair, it is not right, but that is the way it is." The old wizard closed his eyes, as though in brief pain, and then opened them again. "Harry, the most painful truth any hero must learn is that the right cannot, should not, must not win every battle. All of this began when Miss Granger fought 3 older enemies and won. If she had been content with this, the echoes of her deed would have died away in time. Yet instead she banded together with her classmates and raised her wand in open challenge to Peregrine Derek and all his kind, and his kind cannot but raise their own wands in answer. So James Astorga went hunting her, and in the natural course he would have beaten her. It would have been a sad day, but it would have ended there. There is not enough magic in 8 first-year witches altogether to defeat such a foe. But you could not accept that, Harry, could not let Miss Granger learn her own lessons. And so you sent the defense professor to watch over them invisibly and pierce Astorga's shields when Daphne Greengrass struck at him. What? Thought Harry. The old wizard went on speaking. Each time you intervened, Harry, it escalated matters further and yet further. Soon Miss Granger was facing Robert Jugson himself, the son of a Death Eater, with 2 strong allies at his side. Painful indeed it would have been for her if Miss Granger had lost that battle. And yet again, by your will and Quirinus's hand, this time shown more openly, she won. Harry was still struggling with the notion of the defense professor watching invisibly over SPHEW, guarding the heroines from harm. "And so," the old wizard finished, "that is how we came to today, Harry, to 44 students attacking 8 first-year witches. A full battle in these halls. I know it was not your intent, but you must accept some measure of responsibility. Such things did not happen before you came to this school, not through all my decades in Hogwarts, neither when I was a student nor when I was a professor." "Thank you very much," Harry said evenly, "though I think Professor Quirrell deserves more credit than me." The blue eyes widened. "Harry, those bullies were attacking victims long before this year," Harry said. Despite his best efforts, his voice was starting to rise. "But nobody seems to have taught the students that they're allowed to fight back. I know it's much harder to ignore a 2-sided fight than some helpless victims getting hexed or almost pushed out of windows, but it's not exactly worse, is it? I wish I'd read more of Godric Gryffindor's writings so I could quote him. There's got to be something in there about this. Open battle may be louder than the victims suffering in silence. It may be harder to pretend that nothing is happening, but the final result is better." "No, it is not," Dumbledore said. "It is not, Harry, to always fight the darkness, to never let evil pass unchallenged. That is not heroism, but simple pride. Even Godric Gryffindor did not think that every war was worth fighting, though he went his whole life from one battle to another." The old wizard's voice went quieter. "Truth, Harry, the words you speak, they are not evil. No, not evil, and yet they have frightened me. You are one who might someday wield great power over wizardry, over your fellow wizards. And if, come that day, you still think that evil must never pass unchallenged." Now a note of real worry had entered the headmaster's voice. "The world has grown more fragile since the age when Hogwarts was raised. I fear it cannot bear the fury of another Godric Gryffindor, and he was slower to his wrath than you." The old wizard shook his head. "You are too ready to fight, Harry, much too ready to fight, and Hogwarts itself is becoming a more violent place around you." "Well," Harry said carefully after weighing his words, "I don't know if it will help to say this, but I think you're getting the wrong impression of what I'm all about. I don't like real fighting either. It's scary and violent, and somebody might get hurt. But I didn't fight today, headmaster." The headmaster frowned. "You sent the defense professor in your place. Professor Quirrell didn't do any fighting either, Harry said calmly. There wasn't anyone there strong enough to fight him. What happened today wasn't fighting, it was winning. It was a while then before the old wizard spoke. That may be as it may be, the headmaster said, but all these conflicts must end. I can hear the strain in the air, and with each of these clashes it rises. All this must end, decisively and soon. You must not stand in the way of its ending. The old wizard gestured toward the great oaken door of his office, and Harry departed through it. It was with some surprise that Harry stepped out from between the huge grey gargoyles which had made way for him, and saw that Quirrell was still slumped against the stone of the corridor wall, a thick thread of spittle drooling from his slack mouth onto his professorial robes, in just the same position he'd occupied when Harry had first gone up into the headmaster's office. Harry waited, but the slumped man didn't rise up, and after long, awkward seconds, Harry began to walk down the corridor again. "Mr. Potter," came a soft call after Harry had turned two corners, a quiet voice carrying unnaturally through the halls. When Harry had returned, he found Professor Quirrell still slumped against the wall, but the pale eyes now watched him with keen intelligence. "I'm sorry to have tired you out." It was something that Harry couldn't say. He'd noticed the correlation between the effort Professor Quirrell expended and the time he had to spend resting. But Harry had reasoned that if the effort was too painful or detrimental, surely Professor Quirrell would just say no. Now Harry was wondering if that reasoning had actually been correct, and if not, how to apologize. The defense professor spoke in a quiet voice, the rest of the body unmoving. "How went your meeting with the headmaster, Mr. Potter?" "I'm not sure," Harry said. "Not the way I predicted. He seems to believe the light should lose a lot more often than I'd consider wise. Plus, I'm not sure he understands the difference between trying to fight and trying to win. It explains a lot, actually." Harry hadn't read much about the Wizarding War, but he'd read enough to know that the good guys probably had acquired a pretty accurate picture of who most of the worst Death Eaters were, and hadn't just owled them all hand grenades over the course of 5 minutes. A soft, soft laugh from the pale lips. "Dumbledore does not comprehend the enjoyment of winning, just as he does not comprehend the enjoyment of the game. Tell me, Mr. Potter, did you suggest this little plan with the deliberate intention of relieving my tedium?" "That was among my many motives," Harry said, because some instinct had warned that he couldn't just say yes. "Do you know," the defense professor said in soft, reflective tones, "there are those who have tried to soften my darker moods, and those who have indeed participated in brightening my day. But you are the first person ever to succeed in doing it deliberately." The defense professor seemed to straighten up from the wall with a peculiar motion, which might have included magic as well as muscle, and the defense professor began to walk away without a look back in Harry's direction. Only a single small gesture of one finger indicated that Harry was to follow. "I particularly enjoyed that chant you composed for Miss Davis," said Professor Quirrell, after they had walked a short distance, "though you might have been wiser to consult me in advance, before giving it to her to memorize." One hand bestirred itself to within the defense professor's robes and drew forth a wand, which traced a small gesture in the air, after which all the faraway sounds of the castle Hogwarts fell silent. "Tell me honestly, Mr. Potter, have you somehow acquired a familiarity with the theory of dark rituals? That is not the same as confessing an intent to cast them. Many wizards know the principles." "No," Harry said slowly. He had decided some time ago against trying to sneak into the restricted section of the Hogwarts library, for much the same reason he decided a year earlier not to look up how to make explosives out of common household materials. Harry prided himself on at least having more sense than people thought he did. "Oh," said Professor Quirrell. The man was walking more normally now, and the lips curved about in a peculiar smile. "Why, perhaps you possess a natural talent for the field, then." "Yes, well," Harry said wearily. "I suppose Dr. Seuss also has a natural talent for dark rituals, because the part about shuffle, duffle, muzzle, muff came from a children's book called Bartholomew and the Oobleck." "No, not that part," said Professor Quirrell. His voice grew a little stronger, took on some of its normal lecturing tone. "An ordinary charm, Mr. Potter, can be cast merely by speaking certain words, making precise motions of the wand, expending some of your own strength. Even powerful spells may be invoked in this way if the magic is efficient as well as efficacious. But with the greatest of magics, speech alone does not suffice to give them structure. You must perform specific actions, make significant choices, nor is the temporary expenditure of your own strength sufficient to set them in motion. A ritual requires permanent sacrifice. The power of such a greater spell, compared to ordinary charms, can be like day compared to night. But many rituals, indeed, most happen to demand at least one sacrifice which might inspire squeamishness. And so, the entire field of ritual magic, containing all the furthest and most interesting reaches of wizardry, is widely regarded as dark, with a few exceptions carved out by tradition, of course. Professor Quirrell's voice took on a sardonic tinge. The unbreakable vow is too useful to certain wealthy houses to be outlawed entirely, even though to bind a man's will through all his days is indeed a dread and terrible act, more fearsome than many lesser rituals that wizards shun. A cynic might conclude that which rituals are prohibited is not so much a matter of morality as habit, but I digress. Professor Quirrell made a brief coughing sound, a clearing of his throat. The unbreakable vow requires 3 participants and 3 sacrifices. The one who receives the unbreakable vow must be one who could have come to trust the vower, but chooses instead to demand the vow from them, and they sacrifice that possibility of trust. The one who makes the vow must be someone who could have chosen to do what the vow demands of them, and they sacrifice that capacity for choice. And the third wizard, the binder, permanently sacrifices a small portion of their own magic to sustain the vow forever. Ah, Harry said. I'd wondered why that spell wasn't used all over the place, every time 2 people have difficulty trusting each other. Although, why don't wizards on their deathbeds charge money to bind unbreakable vows and use that to leave an inheritance for their children? Because they are stupid, said Professor Quirrell. There are hundreds of useful rituals which could be performed if men had so much sense. I could name 20 without stopping to draw breath. But in any case, Mr. Potter, the thing about such rituals, whether or not you choose to term them dark, is that they are shaped to be magically efficacious, not to appear impressive when performed. I suppose there is a certain tendency for the more powerful rituals to require more dreadful sacrifices. Even so, the most terrible ritual known to me demands only a rope which has hanged a man and a sword which has slain a woman, and that for a ritual which promised to summon death itself. Though what is truly meant by that I do not know, and do not care to discover, since it was also said that the counterspell to dismiss death had been lost. The most dread chant I have encountered does not sound even 100th as fearsome as the chant you composed for Miss Davis. Those among the bullies who had a passing familiarity with dark rituals, and I am certain that there were some, must have been terrified beyond the capacity of words to describe. If there existed a true ritual which appeared that impressive, Mr. Potter, it would melt the earth. Said Harry. Professor Quirrell's lips twisted further. But the truly amusing thing was this. You see, Mr. Potter, the chant of every ritual names that which is to be sacrificed, and that which is to be gained. The chant which you gave to Miss Davis spoke, first, of a darkness beyond darkness, buried beneath the flow of time, which knows the gate and is the gate. And the second thing spoken of, Mr. Potter, was the manifestation of your own presence. And always in each element of the ritual, first is named that which is sacrificed, and then is said the use commanded of it. I see, said Harry, as he trod through the halls of Hogwarts after Professor Quirrell, following him toward the defense professor's office. So my chant, the way I wrote it, implies that the outer guard, Yog-Sothoth, was permanently sacrificed in a ritual which but briefly manifested your presence, said Professor Quirrell. I suppose we will discover tomorrow whether anyone took that seriously, when we read the newspapers, and see whether all the magical nations of the world are banding together in a desperate effort to seal off your incursion into our reality. They walked on, as the defense professor began chuckling, odd throaty sounds. The 2 of them didn't talk after that until they came to the defense professor's office, and then the man halted with his hand upon the door. It is a very strange thing, the defense professor said, his voice now soft again, almost inaudible. The man was not looking at Harry, and Harry saw only his back. A very strange thing. There was a time when I would have sacrificed a finger from my wand hand to work upon the bullies of Hogwarts as we have worked upon them this day. To make them fear me as they now fear you, To have the deference of all the students and the adoration of many, I would have given my finger for that. You have everything now that I wanted then. All that I know of human nature says that I should hate you, and yet I do not. It is a very strange thing. It should have been a touching moment, but instead Harry felt a coldness traveling down his spine, as though he were a little fish in the sea, and some vast white shark had just looked him over and decided, after a visible hesitation, not to eat him. The man opened the door to Defense Professor's office and passed within and was gone. Aftermath. Her fellow Slytherins were looking at Daphne like they didn't have the faintest idea of how to look at her. The Gryffindors were looking at her like they didn't have the faintest idea of how to look at her. Showing no fear, Daphne Greengrass strode into the potions classroom, wrapped in the imperious dignity of a noble and most ancient house. Inside, she was feeling much the same way everyone else probably did. It had been 2 hours since the what, when the what had happened, and Daphne's brain was still going. What? 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 The classroom was quiet as they all waited for Professor Snape to arrive. Lavender and Parvati sat near a cluster of other Gryffindors, surrounded by silent stares. The two of them were looking over each other's homework before class started, and nobody else was helping them or talking to them. Even Lavender, who Daphne would have sworn could never be fazed by anything, seemed subdued. Daphne sat down at her desk and took magical drafts and potions out of her bag and began looking over her own homework, doing her very best to act normal. People stared at her and said nothing. A gasp went through the whole classroom. Girls and boys flinched back, leaning away from the door like they were stalks of wheat touched by a gust of wind. In the door stood Tracy Davis, wrapped in a black tattered cloak which had been draped over her Hogwarts uniform. Tracy walked slowly into the classroom, swaying slightly with each step, looking like she was trying to drift. She sat down at her accustomed desk, which happened to be right next to Daphne's. Slowly Tracy's head turned to stare at Daphne. "See," the Slytherin girl said in a low, sepulchral tone. "I told you I'd get him before she did." "What?" blurted Daphne, who immediately wished she hadn't said anything. "I got Harry Potter before Granger did." Tracy's voice was still low, but her eyes were gleaming with triumph. "See, Daphne, what General Potter wants in a girl isn't a pretty face or a pretty dress. He wants a girl willing to channel his dread powers. That's what he wants. Now I'm his and he's mine." This announcement produced a frozen silence through the whole classroom. "Excuse me, Miss Davis," said the cultured voice of Draco Malfoy, who seemed unconcerned as he shuffled through his own potions parchments. The other scion of a most ancient house didn't so much as glance up from his desk, even as everyone else turned to look at him. "Did Harry Potter actually tell you that, using those words?" "Well, no," Tracy said, and then her eyes flashed angrily. "But he'd better take me in, now that I've sacrificed my soul to him and everything." "You sacrificed your soul to Harry Potter," gasped Millicent. There was a clatter from the other side of the room as Ron Weasley dropped his inkwell. "Well, I'm pretty sure I did," said Tracy, sounding briefly uncertain before she rallied. "I mean, I looked at myself in a mirror, and I look paler now, and I can always feel darkness surrounding me, and I was a conduit for his dread powers and everything." "Daphne, you also saw my eyes go green, right? I didn't see it myself, but that's what I heard afterward." There was a pause, broken only by the sounds of Ron Weasley trying to clean up his desk. "Daphne," said Tracy. "I don't believe it," said an angry voice. "There's no way the next Dark Lord would take you to be his bride." Slowly, and with considerable disbelief, heads turned to stare at Pansy Parkinson. "Hush, you," said Tracy, "or I'll." The Slytherin girl paused. Then Tracy's voice went even lower and she said, "Hush, you, or I'll devour your soul." "You can't do that," said Pansy, in the confident tones of a hen which had worked out a perfectly good pecking order where she was at the top, and wasn't about to go updating that belief based on mere evidence. Slowly, like she was trying to float, Tracy got up from her desk. There were more gasps. Daphne felt like she'd been petrified in place within her chair. "Tracy," said Lavender in a small voice. "Please don't do all that again, please." Now Pansy was showing definite nervousness as Tracy swayed toward her desk. "What do you think you're doing?" Pansy said, not quite managing to sound indignant. "I told you," Tracy said menacingly. "I'm going to devour your soul." Tracy bent down over Pansy, who sat frozen at her desk, and with their lips almost touching made a loud inhaling noise. "There," said Tracy as she straightened. "I ate your soul." No, you didn't, said Pansy. Did too, said Tracy. There was a very slight pause. Merlin, she did, cried Theodore Nott. You look all pale now, and your eyes seem empty. What? Screeched Pansy, turning pale. The girl leapt up from her desk and began frantically rummaging through her book bag. After Pansy drew out a mirror and looked at herself, she turned even paler. Daphne abandoned all pretense of aristocratic poise and let her head fall to the desk with a dull thud, as she wondered whether going to the same school as all the other important families was really worth going to the same school as the Chaos Legion. Ooh, you're in trouble now, Pansy, said Seamus Finnegan. I don't know exactly what happens when a Dementor kisses you, but if Tracy Davis kisses you, that's probably even worse. I've heard about people without souls, Dean Thomas said gloomily. They have to dress all in black and they write awful poetry and nothing ever makes them happy. They're all angsty. I don't want to be angsty, cried Pansy. Too bad, said Dean Thomas. You've got to be now that your soul's gone. Pansy turned and stretched out a begging hand toward Draco Malfoy's desk. Draco, she said pleadingly. Mr. Malfoy, please make Tracy give me back my soul. I can't, said Tracy. I ate it. Make her throw it up, yelled Pansy. The heir of Malfoy had slumped forward, resting his head in both hands so that nobody could see his face. Why is my life like this? Said Draco Malfoy. A wild babble of whispers started up as Tracy returned to her desk, now smiling in satisfaction, while Pansy stood in the midst of the classroom, wringing her hands and tears starting from her eyes. Be quiet. The soft, lethal voice seemed to fill the whole classroom as Professor Snape stalked in through the door. His face was angrier than Daphne had ever seen it, sending a jolt of genuine fear down her spine. Hastily, she looked down at her homework. Sit down, Parkinson, the potions master hissed. And you, Davis, take off that ridiculous cloak. Professor Snarab, wailed Pansy Parkinson in tears. Tracy ate my Sewell. 75. Self-actualization final. Responsibility. It was a looping, meandering alley in the midst of Hogwarts, wandering like a stray lock of hair. Sometimes crossing itself, it seemed, but you couldn't ever get to the end if you gave in to the temptation of apparent shortcuts. At the end of the tangle, 6 students leaned against rough stones, robes black against the grey walls and trimmed in green, eyes darting from one to each other. Torches burned in the windowless sconce, casting light to ward off the darkness and heat to ward off the chill of the Slytherin dungeons. I am certain, Reese Belker snapped, absolutely certain that was no true ritual. Little thirsty witches can't do that kind of magic, and even if they could, who's ever heard of a dark ritual which sacrifices a sealed horror for that? Were you, said Lucian Bowl. I mean, after that girl snapped her fingers, Belker's glare should have melted him. No, she spat, I was not. That is, she wasn't naked, drawled Marcus Flint, his broad shoulders leaning back in apparent relaxation against the lumpy stone surface. Covered in chocolate frosting, yes, but not naked. This day Potter has offered great insult to our houses, said the grim voice of J. Mastorga. Yes, well, I'm sorry to be blunt, Randolph Lee said evenly. The 7th-year duelist rubbed at his chin, where a faint fuzz of beard had been allowed to grow. But when someone sticks you to the ceiling, it's a message, Astorga. It's a message which says, I'm an incredibly powerful dark wizard who could have done anything to you I damn well pleased, and I don't care if your house is offended, either. Robert Jugson, Roman 3, gave a soft, low laugh at this, a chuckle that sent chills down several spines. It makes you wonder if you picked the wrong side, doesn't it? I've heard tales about messages like that, sent at the old Dark Lord's bidding. I'm not ready to kneel to Potter just yet, said Astorga, staring hard into Jugson's eyes. Neither am I, said Belker. Jugson was holding his wand, and he turned it idly back and forth in his fingers, pointing it up and then downward. Are you a Gryffindor or a Slytherin? Said Jugson. Everyone's got a price. Everyone's smart. This statement produced a moment of silence. Shouldn't Malfoy be here? Bowl said tentatively. Flint gave a dismissive flick of his fingers. Whatever Malfoy's plotting, he wants to put on an air of innocence. He can't be seen missing at the same time as us. But everyone knows that already, said Bowl, even in the other houses. Yes, very clumsy, said Belker. She snorted. Malfoy or no, he's just a little thirsty and we don't need him here. I will owl my father, Jugson said softly, and he will speak to Lord Malfoy himself. Abruptly, Jugson stopped speaking. Don't know about you, dearies, Belka said with fake sweetness, but I don't plan on running scared from a false ritual, and I'm not done with Potter and his pet mudblood. Nobody answered. All their gazes were looking past her. Slowly, Belka turned around to see what the others were staring at. You will do nothing, hissed their head of house. Severus Snape's face was enraged. When he spoke, small spots of spittle flew from his mouth, further darting his already dirtied robes. You fools have done enough. You have embarrassed my house lost to first years. Now you speak of embroiling noble lords of the Wisengamot in your pathetic childish squabbles. I shall deal with this matter. You will not embarrass this house again. You will not risk embarrassing this house again. You are done with fighting witches, and if I hear otherwise, if you thought they'd be sitting next to each other at dinner time, after that, you'd be quite mistaken. What does she want from me? Came the plaintive cry of a boy who, for all his extensive reading in the scientific literature, was still a bit naive about certain things. Did she want to get beaten up? The upper-year Ravenclaw boys who'd sat down next to him at the dinner table exchanged swift glances with each other until, by some unspoken protocol, the most experienced of their number spoke. Look, said Artie Gray, the seventh year who was leading in their competition by 3 witches and a defense professor. The thing you've got to understand is, just because she's angry doesn't mean you lost points. Miss Granger is angry because she got all frightened, and you're there to be blamed, you understand. But at the same time, even though she won't admit it, she'll be touched that her boyfriend went to such ridiculous and frankly insane lengths to protect her. This is not about points, ground out Harry Potter, the words visibly escaping from between his clenched teeth. Dinner sat ignored on the table in front of him. This is about justice, and I am, not her, boyfriend. This was met by a certain amount of sniggering from all present. Yeah, well, said a 6th-year Ravenclaw boy, I think after she kisses you to bring you out of dementation and you stick 44 bullies to the ceiling for her, we've gone way past. She's not my girlfriend, really, and into the question of what your kids will be like. Wow, that's a scary thought. The Ravenclaw trailed off and then said, in a smaller voice, Please don't look at me like that. Look, said Artie Gray, I'm sorry to be blunt about this, but you can have justice or you can have girls. You can't have both at the same time. He clapped a companionable hand on Harry Potter's shoulder. You've got potential, kid, more potential than any wizard I've ever seen, but you've got to learn how to use it, you know. Be a bit sweeter to them, learn some spells to clean up that mess you call hair. Above all, you need to hide your evilness better, not too well, but better. Nice, well-groomed boys get girls, and dark wizards also get girls, but nice, well-groomed boys suspected of being secretly dark get more girls than you can imagine. Not interested, Harry said flatly, as he picked up the boy's hand from his shoulder and unceremoniously dropped it. But you will be, said Artie Gray, his voice low and foreboding. Ah, you will be. Elsewhere along the same table, romantic, shrieked Hermione Granger, so loudly that some of the girls next to her winced. What part of that was romantic? He didn't ask. He never asks. He just sends ghosts after people and glues them to ceilings and does whatever he wants with my life. But don't you see, said a 4th-year witch, it means that even though he's evil, he loves you. You're not helping, said Penelope Clearwater a little further down the table, but she was ignored. Several older witches had started toward Hermione after she'd sat down at the extreme opposite end of the table from Harry Potter, but then a swifter cloud of younger girls had surrounded Hermione in an impenetrable barrier. Boys, said Hermione Granger, should not be allowed to love girls without asking them first. This is true in a number of ways, and especially when it comes to gluing people to the ceiling. This was also ignored. It's just like a play, sighed a 3rd-year girl. A play, said Hermione. I'd like to see the play where anything like this happens. Oh, said the 3rd-year girl. I was thinking of that really romantic one, where there's this very nice, sweet boy who makes a flute call. Only he mispronounces his destination and stumbles out into this room full of dark wizards who are performing a forbidden ritual that should have stayed forever lost to time. And they're sacrificing 7 victims in order to unseal this ancient horror which is supposed to grant someone a wish if it's freed. So of course the boy's presence interrupts the ritual. And as the horror is eating all the dark wizards, and everyone is dying, the boy's last thought is that he wishes he could have had a girlfriend, And the next thing you know, the boy is lying in the lap of this beautiful woman whose eyes are burning with a dreadful light. Only she doesn't understand anything about being human, so the boy always has to stop her eating people. This is just like that play, only you're the boy and Harry Potter is the girl. That, Hermione said, feeling quite surprised. That actually does sound something like, "It does," blurted a second-year girl sitting across the table, who was now leaning forward, looking horrified and yet even more fascinated. "No," said Hermione. "I mean, he's not my boyfriend." 2 seconds later, Hermione's ears caught up with what her lips had just said. The fourth-year witch put her hand on Hermione's shoulder and gave her a comforting squeeze. "Miss Granger," she said in a soothing voice, "I think if you're really honest with yourself, you'll admit that the real reason you're angry with your Dark Master is that he channeled his unspeakable powers through Tracy Davis instead of you." Hermione's mouth opened, but her throat locked up before the words came out, which was probably a good thing, because if she'd actually yelled that loudly it would have broken something. "How's that possible, actually?" said the third-year girl. "I mean for Harry Potter to work through another girl even though he's bound himself to you. Do the three of you have one of those, arrangements?" "Gag," said Hermione Granger, her throat still locked, her brain halted, and her vocal cords spontaneously making a noise like she was coughing up a yak. "Later. I don't understand why you're being so unreasonable," said another second-year witch, who'd replaced the third-year girl after Hermione had threatened to ask Tracy to eat her soul. "I mean, really, if someone like Harry Potter rescued me, I'd be sending him thank you cards and hugging him," and the girl's face was a bit red. "Well, kissing him, I'd hope." "Yeah," said the other second-year witch. "I've never understood why girls in plays get angry when the main character goes out of his way to be nice to them. I wouldn't act like that if the hero liked me." Hermione Granger had dropped her head to the dinner table, her hands slowly pulling at her hair. "You just don't understand male psychology," the fourth-year witch said in an authoritative voice. "Granger's got to make it look like she can mysteriously resist his seductive charm, even later." And so, before long, Hermione Granger had turned to the only person left she could talk to, the only person guaranteed to understand her point of view. "They're all mad," said Hermione Granger as she strode vigorously toward Ravenclaw Tower, having left dinner a bit early. "Everyone except you and me, Harry. I mean everyone except us in this whole school of Hogwarts. They're all entirely mad. And Ravenclaw girls are the worst. I don't know what Ravenclaw girls go reading when they get older, but I'm certain they ought not to be reading it. One witch asked me if the two of us had soul bonded, which I'm going to look up in the library tonight, but I'm pretty sure has never actually happened. I don't even know a name for this kind of fallacious reasoning," said Harry Potter. The boy was walking normally, which meant he often had to skip forward a few steps to match her own indignation-fueled speed. "I seriously think if it was up to them, they'd be dragging us off this minute to get our names changed to Potter Evans Vers Granger." Ah, saying that out loud makes me realize how awful it sounds. "You mean your name would be Potter Evans Vers Granger, and mine would be Granger Potter Evans Vers," said Hermione. "It's too horrible to imagine." "No," said the boy, "House Potter is a noble house, so I think that name stays in front." "What?" she said indignantly. "Who says we have to?" There was a sudden awful silence, broken only by the thuds of their shoes. "Anyhow," Hermione said hastily, "some of the crazy things they said at dinner got me thinking, so I just want to say, Harry, that I really am grateful to you for saving me and everybody from getting beat up, and even though some parts of this afternoon upset me, I'm sure we can just talk about it calmly." "Ah," Harry said with a faint and tentative smile, his eyes showing a mixture of befuddlement and apprehension. "That's good, I guess." To be specific, there had been the fourth-year witch explaining that, since Harry was the evil wizard who'd fallen in love with Hermione, and Hermione was the pure and innocent girl who would either redeem him or get seduced by the dark arts herself. It followed that Hermione had to be perpetually indignant at anything Harry did, even if it was him heroically saving her from certain doom, just so that their romance wouldn't resolve itself before the end of Act Roman 4. And then Penelope Clearwater, who Hermione had really thought was smarter than that, had remarked in a loud voice that, for identical reasons, it was impossible for Hermione to just go over and talk sensibly with Harry about why she was feeling hurt, And anyway, dark wizards were attracted to passionate defiance in a woman, not logic. This was the point at which Hermione had shoved herself up from the benches, stomped furiously over to where Harry was sitting, and asked him in a reasonable voice if the two of them could go for a walk and sort things out. "So in other words," Hermione said in her calmest voice ever, "you're not really in trouble with me. I'm still talking to you. We're still friends, and we're still studying together. We're not having a fight. Right." Somehow this only seemed to increase Harry Potter's apprehension. "Right," said the boy who lived. "Great," said Hermione. "So, have you worked out why I was upset, Mr. Potter?" There was a pause. "You wanted me to keep out of your affairs," Harry said cautiously. "I mean, I know you wanted to do things on your own, and I was staying out of your way until I'd heard you gotten ambushed by 3 junior Death Eaters, and honestly, I wasn't expecting that. Professor Quirrell wasn't expecting that. I started to worry you'd gotten in over your head, and then, no offense, Hermione, 44 bullies in a massed ambush is way beyond what anyone could handle without help. That's why I thought you really needed help just that once." "No, that part's fine," said Hermione. "We were in over our heads, honestly. Please guess again, Mr. Potter." Said Harry. "What Tracy did." "Startled you." "Startled me, Mr. Potter." There might have been a touch of acidity in her voice. "No, Mr. Potter, I was scared. I was frightened. I wouldn't want to admit to being afraid of just dragons or something. People might think I was cowardly, but when you can hear distant voices crying, Tekelilai, Tekelilai, and there's pools of blood seeping out from under all the doors, then it's okay to be scared." "I am sorry," Harry said with what sounded like genuine regret. "I thought you'd realize it was me. And the reason we all got scared like that, Mr. Potter, was that you didn't ask first." Despite her intentions, Hermione found her voice was rising again. "You should have asked me before you did something like that, Harry. You should have said very specifically, 'Hermione, can I make blood come out from under the doors?' It's important to be specific when you're asking about that sort of thing." The boy rubbed the back of his neck as he walked. Honestly, I just thought you'd have to say no." "Yes, Mr. Potter, I could have said no. That's the whole point of asking first, Mr. Potter. No, I mean you'd have had to say no, whether or not it was what you really wanted, and then all of you would have gotten beaten up, and it would have been my fault for asking first." Hermione's eyebrows went up in a bit of surprise, and she kept walking for a few steps while she tried to understand this. "What?" she said. "Well," the boy said a bit slowly. "I mean, you're the Sunshine General, aren't you? You couldn't say yes to me scaring people, not even bullies, not even to save your friends from getting beaten up. You would have had to say no, and then you would have gotten hurt. This way, you can tell people honestly that you had no idea and that it wasn't your fault. That's why I didn't warn you." Hermione stopped walking, turned to face Harry full on instead of just turning her head. Her voice was carefully even as she said, "Harry, you've got to stop coming up with clever reasons for doing stupid things." Harry's eyebrows flew up. After a moment he said, "Look, I know what you mean, of course, but there's still the question of whether it's actually is a good idea, not just a clever one. I understand why you did what you did today," Hermione said. "But I want you to promise that from now on you'll ask me first, always, even if you can come up with a reason why you shouldn't." There was a pause that stretched, and Hermione could feel her heart sinking. "Hermione," Harry started to say. "Why?" The frustration burst out into her voice. "Why is it so awful? All you have to do is ask." Harry's eyes were very serious. "Who in SPHEW do you try hardest to defend, Hermione? Who are you most afraid for when you fight?" "Hannah Abbott," Hermione said without having to think about it, and then felt a little bad, because Hannah was trying hard and she had improved a lot. Would you feel okay about trusting someone else, like Tracy, with final responsibility for protecting Hannah? If you knew Hannah was about to walk into an ambush, and you came up with a plan for protecting her, would you feel good about letting Tracy say whether or not you were allowed to do it? "Well, no," said Hermione, puzzled. The green eyes of the boy who lived were steady on hers. "Would you trust Hannah to have the final say in whether she needed protecting?" Said Hermione, and then paused. It was strange. She knew the right answer, and she also knew the right answer wasn't actually true. Hannah was trying so hard to prove she wasn't afraid, even though she was, and it was easy to see how the Hufflepuff girl might try too hard. Then Hermione realized the implication. "You think I'm like Hannah?" "Not exactly." Harry ran his hands through his mess of hair. "Listen, Hermione, what would you have suggested doing if I'd warned you about an ambush by 44 bullies?" I would have done the responsible thing and told Professor McGonagall and let her take care of it, Hermione said promptly. And then there wouldn't have been darkness and people screaming and horrible blue light. But Harry just shook his head. That's not the responsible thing to do, Hermione. It's what someone playing the role of a responsible girl would do. Yes, I thought of going to Professor McGonagall, but she would have only stopped the disaster once. Probably before any disturbance happened in the first place, like by telling the bullies she knew. If the bullies got punished just for plotting, it would be by losing house points, or at worst a day's detention, not anything that would really scare them. And then the bullies would have tried again. Fewer of them, with better operational security, so I didn't hear about it. They would probably ambush one of you alone. Professor McGonagall doesn't have the authority to do something scary enough to protect you, and she wouldn't have overstepped her authority because she's not really responsible. Professor McGonagall isn't responsible, Hermione said incredulously. She jammed her hands on her hips, now openly glaring at him. Are you nuts? The boy didn't blink. You could call it heroic responsibility, maybe, Harry Potter said. Not like the usual sort. It means that whatever happens, no matter what, it's always your fault. Even if you tell Professor McGonagall she's not responsible for what happens, you are. Following the school rules isn't an excuse. Someone else being in charge isn't an excuse. Even trying your best isn't an excuse. There just aren't any excuses. You've got to get the job done no matter what. Harry's face tightened. That's why I say you're not thinking responsibly, Hermione. Thinking that your job is done when you tell Professor McGonagall, that isn't heroine thinking. Like Hannah being beat up is okay then, because it isn't your fault anymore. Being a heroine means your job isn't finished until you've done whatever it takes to protect the other girls, permanently. In Harry's voice was a touch of the steel he had acquired since the day Fawkes had been on his shoulder. You can't think as if just following the rules means you've done your duty. I think, Hermione said evenly, that you and I might disagree about some things, Mr. Potter. Like whether you or Professor McGonagall is more responsible, and whether being responsible usually involves people running around and screaming, and how much it's a good idea to follow school rules. And just because we disagree, Mr. Potter, doesn't mean that you get the final say. Well, said Harry, you asked what was so awful about having to ask you first, and it was a surprisingly good question, so I examined my mind, and that's what I found. I think my real fear is that if Hannah is in trouble and I come up with a way to save her that seems weird or dark or something, you might not weigh the consequences to Hannah. You might not accept the heroine's responsibility of coming up with some way to save her, somehow, no matter what. Instead, you just carry out the role of Hermione Granger, the sensible Ravenclaw girl, and the role of Hermione Granger automatically says no, whether or not she has a better plan in mind. And then 44 bullies will take turns beating up Hannah Abbott, and it'll all be my fault because I knew, even if I didn't want reality to be that way, I knew that was how it would go. I'm pretty sure that was my secret, wordless, unutterable fear. The frustration was building up inside her again. It's my life, Hermione burst out. She could imagine what it would be like with Harry messing with her all the time, constantly inventing justifications not to ask her first and not to listen to her objections. She shouldn't have to win an argument just to. There'll always be some reason. You can always say I'm not thinking right. I want my own life. Otherwise I'll walk away. I really will. I mean it, Harry. Harry sighed. This is exactly where I didn't want things to end up, and here we are. You're afraid of just the same thing I am, aren't you? Afraid that if you let go of the steering wheel, we'll crash. The corners of his lips twisted, but it didn't look like a real smile. That's something I can understand. I don't think you understand at all, Hermione said sharply. You said we'd be partners, Harry. That stopped him. She could see it stop him. How about this? Harry said at last. I'll promise to ask you first, before I do anything that could be interpreted as meddling in your affairs. Only you've got to promise me to be reasonable, Hermione. I mean really, genuinely, stop and think for 20 seconds first. Treat it as a real choice. The sort of reasonableness where you realize I'm offering a way to protect the other girls, and that if you automatically say no without considering it properly, there's this actual consequence where Hannah Abbott ends up in the hospital. Hermione stared at Harry as his recitation wound down. Well, said Harry, I shouldn't have to make promises, she said, just to be consulted about my own life. She turned from Harry and began walking toward the Ravenclaw Tower, not looking at him. But I'll think about it anyway. She heard Harry sigh, and after that they walked in silence for a while, passing through an archway of some reddish metal like copper, into a corridor that was just like the one they'd left, except that it was tiled in pentagons instead of squares. "Hermione," said Harry, "I've been watching you and thinking, since the day you said you were going to be a hero. You've got the courage. You'll fight for what's right, even in the face of enemies that would scare other people away. You've certainly got the raw intelligence for it, and you're probably a better person inside than I am. But even so, well, to be honest, Hermione, I can't quite see you filling Dumbledore's shoes, leading magical Britain's fight against you-know-who. Not yet, anyway." Hermione had turned her head to stare at Harry, who just went on walking, as though lost in thought. Fill those shoes. She'd never tried to imagine herself that way. She'd never imagined imagining herself that way. "And maybe I'm wrong," Harry said as they walked. "Maybe I've just read too many stories where the heroes never do the sensible thing and follow the rules and tell their Professor McGonagalls. So my brain doesn't think you're a proper storybook hero. Maybe it's you who's the sane one, Hermione, and me who's just being silly. But every time you talk about following rules or relying on teachers, I get that same feeling, like it's bound up with this one last thing that's stopping you, one last thing that puts your PC self to sleep and turns you into an NPC again." Harry let out a sigh. "Maybe that's why Dumbledore said I should have wicked step-parents." "He said what?" Harry nodded. "I still don't know whether the headmaster was joking or... The thing is, he was right in a way. I had loving parents, but I never felt like I could trust their decisions. They weren't sane enough. I always knew that if I didn't think things through myself, I might get hurt. Professor McGonagall will do whatever it takes to get the job done if I'm there to nag her about it. She doesn't break rules on her own without heroic supervision. Professor Quirrell really is someone who gets things done no matter what, and he's the only other person I know who notices stuff like the snitch ruining Quidditch. But him I can't trust to be good. Even if it's sad, I think that's part of the environment that creates what Dumbledore calls a hero, people who don't have anyone else to shove final responsibility onto. And that's why they form the mental habit of tracking everything themselves. Hermione didn't say anything to that, but she was thinking back to something Godric Gryffindor had written near the end of his very short autobiography. Briefly and without any explanation, because the scroll had been meant to be copied by hand, centuries before the Muggle printing press had inspired wizards to invent the reading-writing quill. "No rescuer hath the rescuer," Godric Gryffindor had written. "No lord hath the champion, no mother and no father, only nothingness above." If that was the price of being a hero, Hermione wasn't sure she wanted to pay it. Or maybe, though it wasn't the sort of thing she would have thought, before she started hanging around Harry, maybe Godric Gryffindor had gotten it wrong. "Do you trust Dumbledore?" Hermione said. "I mean, he's right here in our school and he's the most legendary hero in the whole world. He was the most legendary hero," said Harry. "Now he sets chickens on fire. Honestly, does Dumbledore seem reliable to you?" Hermione didn't answer. Side by side, the two of them began to climb huge, wide spiral stairs, the steps alternating between bronze metal and blue stone, the final approach to where the Ravenclaw portrait waited to guard their dorm with silly riddles. "Oh, and I just thought of something I should tell you," Harry said when they were about halfway up. "Since it affects your life and all, think of it as a sort of down payment." "What is it?" said Hermione. "I predict SPHEW is about to retire." "Retire?" Hermione said, almost stumbling on one of the stairs. "Yeah," Harry said. "I mean, I could be wrong, but I suspect the teachers are about to clamp down hard on fighting in the corridors." Harry was grinning as he spoke, a glint in his eyes behind the glasses hinting at secret knowledge. Cast new wards to detect offensive hexes, or start verifying reports of bullying using Veritaserum. I can think of several ways they might shut it down. But if I'm right, it's something to celebrate, Hermione, you and all of you. You kicked up enough public ruckus that you got them to actually do something about the bullying. All the bullying. Slowly, then, a smile began to creep up her lips, and as she reached the top of the stairs and began walking toward the Ravenclaw portrait for her riddle, Hermione felt rather lighter on her feet. a wonderful lifting feeling spreading through her like she'd been pumped full of helium. Somehow, despite all the effort the 8 of them had put in, she hadn't expected that much. She hadn't expected it to actually work. They'd made a difference. It was the end of breakfast time on the next morning. The students from every year sat very still in their benches, all heads turned in the same direction, toward the head table, before which one lone first-year girl stood rigid and motionless, her head tilted back to stare up at the head of House Slytherin. Professor Snape's face was twisted with fury and triumph, vindictive as any painting of a dark wizard, and behind him the other professors sat at the head table, watching with faces as though carved from stone. "Permanently disbanded," spat the potions master. "Your self-proclaimed society is outlawed within Hogwarts by my decision as a professor. If your society or any member of it is discovered fighting in the hallways again, Granger, you will be personally held responsible and expelled by me from the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." That first-year girl stood there, before the head table where she'd been called before only to receive commendations and smiles. Stood there with her spine held tall and upright in its curve like a centaur's bow, giving nothing to the enemy. That first-year witch stood there with all tears and anger bottled, her face still, nothing changing of her outward appearance, while something slowly broke inside her. She could feel it breaking. It broke further when Professor Snape gave her 2 weeks' detention for the crime of violence in school, sneering with the contemptuous face he'd shown them all on the first day of potions, and with a little twist in the corner of his smile that said the potions master knew exactly how unfair he was being. Whatever it was inside her cracked all the way through, from top to bottom, when Professor Snape took 100 points from Ravenclaw. It ended then, and Snape told her she was dismissed. She turned around and saw that, at the Ravenclaw table, Harry Potter was sitting still in his place. She couldn't see his expression from here. She saw his fists on the table, but she couldn't see if they were clenched white like her own. She had whispered to him, when Professor Snape had called her, that he wasn't to do anything without asking first. Hermione wheeled back again to look at the head table, just as Snape was turning away from her to resume his place. "I said you're dismissed, girl," said the sneering voice, but there was a pleased smile on Snape's face, like he was waiting for her to do something. Hermione strode forward another 5 steps toward the head table and said in a breaking voice, "Headmaster." Utter silence filled the great hall. Headmaster Dumbledore said nothing, didn't move. It was as though he, too, was just carved from stone. Hermione turned her gaze to look at Professor Flitwick, whose head, barely visible above the table, seemed to be staring down into his lap. Beside him, Professor Sprout's face was very tight. She seemed to be forcing herself to watch, and her lips were trembling, but she said nothing. Professor McGonagall's chair was empty. The deputy headmistress hadn't shown up to breakfast that morning. "Why aren't any of you saying anything?" said Hermione Granger. Her voice was trembling with the last of her hope, the last desperate reach for help from that place inside her. "You know, what he's doing is wrong. 2 more weeks' detention for insolence," Snape said silkily. It shattered. She looked at the head table for a few seconds longer, at Professor Flitwick and Professor Sprout, and the empty place where Professor McGonagall should have been. Then Hermione Granger turned and began walking toward the Ravenclaw table. There was a babble of voices starting up as the students came unfrozen from where they'd sat. And then, as she was almost to the Ravenclaw table, the dry voice of Professor Quirrell cut through everything, and that voice said, 100 points to Miss Granger for doing what is right." Hermione almost fell over her own feet, and then she continued forward, even as Snape shouted something furious, even as Professor Quirrell leaned back in his chair and began to laugh, even as Dumbledore's voice was saying something she didn't catch, and then she was sitting down at the Ravenclaw table again next to Harry Potter. Harry Potter was frozen beside her. He looked like someone who didn't dare move. "It's all right," her voice said to him, automatically without there being any choice or thought involved, although really it wasn't right at all. "But can you see if you can get me out of Snape's detentions, like you did yourself that time?" Harry Potter nodded, a single jerky motion of his head. "Aye," said Harry. I'm sorry this is all my fault. Don't be ridiculous, Harry." It was odd how her voice was coming out all normal and without her thinking about what to say. Hermione looked down at her breakfast plate. but eating seemed to be clearly out of the question. There was a roiling and churning in her stomach, which suggested that she was already on the verge of throwing up, which was odd because she could have sworn her whole body felt numb, like she wasn't feeling anything at the same time. And, her voice said, if you want to break school rules or something, you can ask me about it. I promise I won't just say no. Non est salvatori salvator, nec defensori dominus, nec pater nec mater, nihil supernum. Godric Gryffindor, 1202 CE.